The first snow came earlier than expected. It always did. One moment, the muddy roads of the village squelched beneath cartwheels and bare feet, and the next, a cold silence settled across the land, as if the world itself had taken a deep breath and decided not to exhale. For the peasants of Bramble Hollow, a quiet village tucked between dense woods and forgotten hills, winter wasn't just a season. It was a question. Would they survive it? Each year, as the winds stiffened and the skies darkened, the villagers began their old, familiar rituals, stacking firewood like prayers, preserving food in pits and jars, sewing threadbare garments for a second or third life. But no matter how many winters they had endured, there was always a sense that this one might be different, that this one might be worse. No one said it aloud. They didn't need to. It showed in the way the older folks looked at the clouds. It whispered through the silences at the communal well, where water had to be fetched before it froze solid. Even the children, usually wild with muddy games and mischief, walked slower now. They listened more, because when the cold came, the stories returned with it. Stories of starvation, of illness, of neighbors who didn't make it. Elsbeth, the midwife, was the first to warn of the signs. She'd been alive longer than most in Bramble Hollow, and remembered the winter her own mother died, huddled near the hearth with a child she couldn't keep warm. That memory clung to her like a scarf she couldn't take off. She said the frost on the branches looked too thick, too soon. She said the birds were quieter this year. She said the cold was coming not just from the sky, but from the earth itself. And yet life didn't stop. It couldn't. The peasants still had to wake early, tend to animals, repair fences, grind grain. They still had to barter for salt and oil, though both were getting scarce. And they still had to hope that the handful of root vegetables they'd managed to dry would stretch far enough. The village itself was a cluster of wattle and daub cottages, their thatched roofs patched with scraps, moss, and faith. Smoke coiled from chimneys in thin, uncertain threads. Inside, families huddled together on straw pallets, sometimes 6 or 7 to a room. The walls didn't keep the cold out, they merely delayed it. And when the wind blew just right, you could hear it whistling through the cracks, telling secrets in a language older than the village itself. Old Thomas, the blacksmith, spent most of his days hammering away in his dim workshop. His forge was one of the few warm places in the village, and people often stopped by just to feel the heat. Thomas rarely spoke, but when he did, people listened. He had once lost a son to a winter illness and hadn't been the same since. He sharpened more than blades, he sharpened caution. There was also Willa, a girl of 13, known for slipping out at dawn to gather kindling and bits of food. Her father had vanished during the last war, and her mother, Agnes, hadn't smiled since. Willa wore his old wool cloak, far too big for her, and had learned how to move like a shadow through the village. She saw things the others missed, cracks in the granary wall, a leak in the roof, a rat near the flour sacks. She was the eyes of the village, even if no one realized it yet. Life in medieval villages wasn't fast or dramatic. Most of it passed in silence, in repetition, in chores and worries and simple joys that seemed too small to matter until they were gone. There was no medicine for the common cold, no heating beyond firewood, no second chances when food ran out. The only real protection peasants had against winter was each other, and even that wasn't always enough. They had customs passed down from their grandparents and theirs before them. They believed in drying certain herbs and hanging them near the door to ward off illness. They believed that placing stones near the hearth could hold heat longer. They believed in telling stories because stories filled the spaces that food couldn't. One of those stories was about a man called Hal the Hollow. He'd lived in Bramble Hollow generations ago and was said to have survived the harshest winter the village ever knew. According to legend, he outsmarted death itself, hiding food in tree trunks and building a fire that never died. Whether he was real or not didn't matter. Every winter, someone would say, "We'll be like Hal," and somehow that made things feel a little less impossible. As December rolled in, the village fell into a rhythm that only winter could teach. Bread grew thinner. Broths grew weaker. Meals were stretched and then stretched again. Still, there was laughter sometimes. Children chasing each other through the snow. couples whispering by the fire, the warm press of a hand when someone brought over an extra loaf of rye or a lump of wax to mend a candle. But the weather was growing worse. Nights dropped colder, the wind howled longer, and then came the frost sickness. It started with a cough, soft, persistent. Then came the shivers, the sweating, the silence. The first to fall ill was Edwin, a farmhand with wide shoulders and gentle eyes. He hadn't missed a day of work in years, but now he could barely rise from his straw bed. His mother, Marta, fed him thin porridge and sat beside him, whispering the Lord's Prayer over and over. But the sickness didn't stop. Soon others were coughing too. The baker's wife, a shepherd boy. Elsbeth did what she could with what she had, a few dried roots, warm cloths, prayers. But there was only so much a midwife could do without food, without fire, without time. Fear began to settle in the village like another layer of snow. People avoided one another. Doors stayed shut longer. Even the well was quieter. Still, the peasants of Bramble Hollow didn't give up. They couldn't. They gathered in the chapel, wrapped in cloaks and hope, and sang hymns with cracked voices. They lit candles and whispered names into the flame. And they waited. By the third week of snow, something had changed. It wasn't just the cold or the hunger. It was something else, a kind of stillness that didn't feel right. The birds had stopped returning. The forest seemed quieter, and the sky, gray, heavy, unblinking, hung over them like a warning. Then, one morning, Willa came running through the village, breath white in the air. She had gone to check on the old grain storage near the woods, a place no one had visited in weeks. What she found there made her stop cold. The doors had been broken. The sacks were slashed open. And there, in the frost-covered mud, were footprints, fresh, but not from any villager she recognized. Someone had been there. Someone who wasn't from Bramble Hollow. And they had taken what little the village might have leaned on in the hardest weeks of winter. Word spread quickly. Suspicion bloomed like frostbite. Was it a traveler? A thief? A bandit? Or worse, someone from the village itself, desperate enough to betray their own? The peace of the village, already hanging by a thread, began to fray. Accusations were whispered. Doors were locked tighter. And Elsbeth, who had once seen everything, looked toward the woods with eyes that feared they no longer knew what lived there. But even in the deep of fear and frost, the village tried to hold together. They still shared what they could, still leaned on old stories and older instincts, because that's what peasants did in the brutal winters. They endured, quietly, softly, 1 hour at a time. Yet, as the days grew darker and the food ran lower, one question remained. Would Bramble Hollow survive this winter? Or would this be the one the stories warned about? And just beyond the tree-line, something moved. Willa stood at the edge of the village square, her breath puffing into the air like smoke from a dying fire. The cold had deepened overnight, and even the sky looked frozen, gray, still, and heavy. She rubbed her hands together inside her father's old cloak, trying to shake the chill, but it wasn't the cold that made her fingers tremble. It was what she had seen near the grain store. The slashed sacks, the footprints, the strange feeling that someone had been watching her from the edge of the trees. Someone, or something, that didn't belong. She hadn't told everything to the others yet. When she burst through the chapel doors earlier that morning, everyone had stared, expecting the worst. Maybe another death, maybe more illness. But she'd only said that the grain was gone and someone had taken it. She left out the part about the tracks. She didn't know why exactly. Maybe she wasn't ready to see the fear in their eyes match her own. Elsbeth took her aside afterward. The midwife's eyes, though cloudy with age, still saw more than most. She asked Willa quiet questions in her small cottage, with a fire flickering low in the hearth and a kettle just barely warm. Willa spoke in soft bursts, unsure how to put into words the feeling that something unnatural had settled near the village. Elsbeth said nothing at first, just stirred the kettle with a twig and nodded slowly. "It's happened before," she said finally, voice low. "Not often, but once, maybe twice in my lifetime. Times when we weren't alone in the snow, when the woods brought more than just deer and wolves." Willa's heart thudded in her chest. "What do you mean?" Elsbeth leaned forward. "There are things out there, child. Desperate things. Not all thieves. Not all men. Some are just hungry shadows. Lost folk. Wanderers with no name. They come when food runs out and fire can't keep them back. But why would they come here? Willa asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Because we still have something to take, Elsbeth replied. Outside, the village went about its routine. If the others were frightened, they hid it well. That was the way of peasants in the Middle Ages. Fear didn't stop the chores. It didn't stop the goats from needing water or the wood from needing splitting. Life had to keep going, even when danger curled around the edges. Thomas the blacksmith didn't speak when Willa passed by his forge later that afternoon. But he didn't look away either. He'd already heard. The grain was gone. He just kept hammering, each strike ringing out into the frozen silence. He was shaping a new latch for the chapel door, something stronger than the old wooden bar. No one asked why. They didn't need to. Further down the road, Agnes, Willa's mother, stood outside their cottage rubbing a torn blanket between her hands. She had a look on her face that Willa couldn't read. Not fear. Not exactly. Something closer to weariness, like a person already bracing for news they didn't want to hear. Willa knew she needed to tell her mother the rest, about the footprints and the strange feeling of being followed. But the words just wouldn't come. Her mother had already lost too much. The rest of the village whispered behind closed doors. The old grain store wasn't just a stash of food. It was hope. The backup plan. The safety net. Without it, the winter ahead looked sharper, darker. Everyone felt it, even if they pretended not to. There would be no extra meals now. No late loaves of bread or thick porridge. From here on, every crumb would be counted. By nightfall, a group of villagers had gathered in the chapel. No one called it a meeting, but that's what it was. A quiet gathering by candlelight, faces pale in the flicker. Elsbeth, Thomas, and the village elder, Aldrich, sat at the front. A few mothers held their children close. Others stood near the door, arms crossed tightly, not from cold but from something deeper. They took the grain, Aldrich said simply. We don't know who, or how, or when, but they did. What matters now is how we respond. A murmur passed through the crowd. No one shouted. That wasn't the way here. Anger came slow in Bramble Hollow, but once it came, it stayed. Do we search the woods? Someone asked from the back. See if they're still near. And what if they are? Another voice replied. What if they're armed? Desperate? What then? We need answers, Elsbeth said, calm but firm. And we need to stay warm. If anyone has food they can spare, even a little, we need to bring it here. Share it. Or this winter will do what the thieves didn't. Thomas stepped forward. He rarely spoke at gatherings, but when he did, people fell quiet. I'll set traps, he said. If anyone else is out there, they'll show themselves. Cold makes people careless. There were nods. Quiet agreement. But still, no one said what they were really thinking. What if it wasn't just people? The days that followed moved slower. Time in winter always dragged, especially in the medieval world. There was no clock to mark the hours, only the rhythm of chores and the shift of light. The sun barely rose before it began to fall again, casting long shadows across the snowy fields. The cold settled deeper into the bones. Fires were lit earlier and died sooner. Each morning, the villagers checked the traps Thomas had placed, small wooden contraptions baited with scraps. But nothing was caught. No animals. No footprints. Nothing. Except once. On the fourth morning, near the edge of the woods, a trap had been tripped. The bait was gone. The string had snapped. And just beside it, barely noticeable beneath a thin sheet of snow, was a single button. Old. Tarnished. Handmade. Thomas brought it back to the village square. Held it up for all to see. It's not one of ours, he said quietly. The button passed from hand to hand. No one recognized it. Not from any coat or cloak in the village. And that unsettled them more than they cared to admit. Meanwhile, the sickness continued. Edwin remained feverish. His mother Marta had stopped coming to the chapel. Some said she was too tired. Others said she was preparing for the worst. The cough had spread to two more children, twins from the north end of the village. Their father now sat at their bedside, eyes sunken from sleepless nights. Still, no one dared speak the word plague. Not yet. It was too soon, or maybe too late. And each night, just before sleep, Willa would lie awake in her narrow bed, staring at the dark wooden beams above her, listening. Listening for the sound of footsteps, of something or someone moving outside the cottage walls. The snow kept falling, and in the forest, something waited. Willa woke before the sun rose, drawn from sleep by a feeling more than a sound. Her breath hung in the air as she sat up beneath the wool blanket, listening. The silence outside was too perfect. No birds, no wind, just the cold pressing in from all sides, like the village was being smothered in snow and shadows. She pulled on her boots, stiff with frost, and crept to the window. The world outside was white and still, the snow undisturbed. But something wasn't right. The stillness felt unnatural, like the earth itself was holding its breath. Her hand tightened around the small wooden charm her mother had carved years ago, a tiny sun meant to bring warmth. It felt useless now, but she couldn't let go. In the distance, near the edge of the trees, she spotted something. Just a flicker, movement, maybe a shape. It vanished as quickly as it appeared. She blinked, leaned closer, and saw nothing. Just the dark outline of the forest, sharp against the snow. But her heart wouldn't settle. By the time she reached the chapel, a few others were already gathered. Thomas stood near the door with his arms folded, watching the horizon. Elsbeth was inside by the hearth, feeding the fire with dried twigs. Her face was pinched, her hands shaking slightly. "We need more fuel," she said to Willa without looking up. "What we have won't last a week." "We've been to the woods every day," Willis said softly. "There's less each time. Most of the dry stuff is gone." Elsbeth nodded. "Then we'll burn green wood if we must. And if that runs out, we burn what we have left." Willa glanced around the chapel. Wooden benches, a small table, shelves. Even the beams could be pulled down if it came to it. The thought made her chest tighten. This chapel had stood longer than any of them had lived. But survival didn't care about sentiment. By midday, the sun had appeared briefly through the clouds, just enough to trick people into thinking it would warm the day. It didn't. The cold stayed heavy, and the air felt brittle, like a single loud noise might crack in two. A group of villagers set off toward the woods with carts and axes, searching for anything that could burn. Willa went with them. She didn't like staying behind. The quiet of the village felt more dangerous now than the frozen trees. The woods were darker than they should have been. Even with the snow on the ground, the canopy above blocked the light. Every snap of a twig, every crunch of snow underfoot echoed too loudly. "Feels like we're being watched," one of the men muttered. Willa didn't respond. She felt it too. They gathered what they could, half-frozen branches, bark, even moss. But before long, someone called out. Thomas, who'd gone ahead to check the traps. His voice came sharp through the trees. "Over here." They rushed toward him, hearts pounding. He stood beside a tree with a strange mark carved into its bark. Not a letter, not a symbol they recognized, just a long, crooked line with a hook at the end, almost like a question mark or a warning. Beneath the mark, the snow had been disturbed. Footprints, several of them, bare feet. Willa knelt, touching one of the prints. It was small, too small for a man, but not a child's either. The toes were wrong, too long, too thin. "Who walks barefoot in this?" someone whispered. Thomas didn't answer. He was staring into the woods, jaw clenched, eyes narrowed. The group made its way back in silence. No one carried much wood. What they'd seen had hollowed their energy. Even the strongest of them kept glancing over their shoulders. Willa didn't speak the whole way home. Her mind was too full of questions she didn't want to ask. That evening, the wind picked up. Snow blew sideways through the village, and the windows rattled in their frames. People stayed indoors, huddled near fires, sharing thin soups and cold bread. A child cried somewhere. A dog barked, then went quiet. Willa sat with her mother in silence. Agnes's hands worked on patching a hole in a tunic, even though her fingers barely had feeling. "Did you find anything?" she asked eventually. "Some wood," Willa said, "and prints." Her mother looked up. "Bare feet," Willa added, "in the snow." Agnes stopped sewing. Her face paled, and her eyes looked far away for a moment. "Like the story your grandfather told?" Willa nodded slowly. She remembered that story, a tale he used to tell on winter nights when the fire burned low. about a pale man who lived in the woods, barefoot, silent, and always watching. A spirit, he called it, or a man who forgot how to be human. He came for villages that got too quiet, too weak. She'd never believed it. Until now, in the middle of the night, a scream tore through the darkness. Willow was on her feet before she even registered the sound. She grabbed her cloak and burst outside. The snow was knee-deep, the wind biting. Lights flickered in the windows of other cottages. People were stirring. Doors opened. Voices called out. The scream had come from Marta's home. By the time they reached it, a small group had gathered. Thomas was already there, lantern in hand, pushing open the door. The inside smelled of sickness and smoke. Edwin lay on the floor, pale and shaking. Marta knelt beside him, clutching him tightly, her face streaked with tears. He was standing over him, she cried. I saw him. I saw something. Who? Thomas asked. Marta shook her head wildly. Not a man. Not right. No sound. He just stood there, watching Edwin. When I screamed, he was gone, slipped out the back like smoke. They searched the area, but there were no fresh prints. No trail, just wind-blown snow. Back in the chapel, the village gathered again. But this time, there was no talk of reason. No careful planning. They're not just stealing from us, someone said. They're watching us. They want something, another added. Elsbeth sat near the fire, silent for a long while. Then she stood. Her voice cracked as she spoke, but her words were clear. If they want something, we'll give them nothing. Not fear, not food, not warmth. We hold together. That's how we've always survived winters like this. But even as she said it, the shadows at the edges of the chapel seemed to move. The wind outside howled, and the fire flickered low. Willa stared into the flame and wondered what kind of winter this really was, and how long they could keep pretending it was just a season. Because whatever was out, there wasn't just hungry. It was waiting. By morning, Edwin still hadn't spoken. His breathing had evened out, but his eyes remained wide open, unfocused, like he was staring through the ceiling. The village doctor, an older woman named Lisa, who mostly treated coughs and infections, sat beside him for hours. She whispered soft prayers and wrapped herbs in cloth, laying them gently across his chest. But there was no change. Whatever he'd seen, or whatever had seen him, had hollowed something out of him. Willa stayed close to Marta that day, helping her fetch water and boil what little broth she could. Marta moved like someone caught in a half-remembered dream. She jumped at small sounds, refused to close the door entirely, and wouldn't let go of the small carving Edwin used to play with as a boy, a simple bird made of bone and wire. Around the village, more whispers spread. The bare footprints were now more than just strange. They were part of a pattern. A few villagers swore they'd seen shapes moving just beyond their homes at night. One girl, no older than 10, said she woke to find someone staring at her through the window. No one had believed her until Marta screamed the night before. Still, there was no proof. Nothing they could hold in their hands. Nothing they could fight. The snow had stopped falling for now, but the cold was sharper. Bitter. Every step outside sent a shiver through the bones. The firewood from the previous day's search barely lasted the night. A new group volunteered to go farther, deeper into the woods. Past the usual traps. Past the trees that felt safe. Willa joined them, despite her mother's protest. You've done enough, Agnes had whispered, clutching her arm before she left. You don't have to prove anything. I'm not trying to prove anything, Willa had replied gently. I just need to know. The forest was even quieter than before. Every branch seemed frozen solid, like they'd been dipped in glass. The snow didn't just crunch underfoot, it shattered. Sound traveled too far. The group didn't speak unless they had to. Every word echoed. They found more strange marks on trees. Not the same one from before. These were different, shorter like slashes. Some looked like arrows. But none of them pointed in the same direction. One pointed up, another down. One curled into a spiral. I've seen marks like this before, one of the men, Bram, muttered. Back when I hunted boar near the ridge. But not this many. Not this close. Made by people? Willa asked. Maybe. Or not. They pressed on, gathering what they could, but something tugged at Willa. Not fear exactly. More like a knowing. Like they weren't meant to be there anymore. like the forest had changed and wasn't theirs to move through. She stopped by a fallen log, brushing away the snow. Beneath, she found bones. Not human. Animal. Maybe a rabbit or something smaller. Picked clean. Arranged in a circle. When she looked up, the others had gone quiet again. Bram had stopped walking. He was staring straight ahead, face pale. Willa followed his gaze. Just beyond the trees, maybe 30 feet away, stood a figure. Not tall. Not short. Wrapped in what looked like furs or maybe bark. But it was the stillness that made her chest tighten. The figure didn't move, not even to breathe. Its face, if there was one, was hidden beneath a hood or shadow. It didn't step forward. It didn't run. It just watched. One of the others, Gerwin, raised his voice. "Who's there?" No answer. He took a step forward. The figure didn't flinch. I said, "Who are you?" Still nothing. But Willa could swear she saw the slightest tilt of the head. Like curiosity, she took Bram's arm gently. "Don't go closer. We need to know." "No," she said. "We don't." They backed away slowly. No one turned their back. No one blinked. By the time they reached the edge of the woods, the figure was gone. No prints left behind. That night, they reported everything to Elsbeth. She didn't speak for a long time, just stared into the fire, brows drawn tight. "This isn't just winter," she said eventually. "This is something older." "What do you mean?" Bram asked. Elsbeth looked toward the chapel windows. Their edges rhymed with frost. "When I was a girl, my grandmother told stories. About hard winters. The kind that didn't come from the sky. She said sometimes the land forgets people. Turns its back on them. She called it the hollow cold." "That's just legend," someone said. "Maybe," Elsbeth said. "Maybe not. But when we forget the land, sometimes it forgets us back." There wasn't much more to say. The firewood was nearly gone again. Rations were thin. And now, people began sleeping in shifts, someone always awake, always watching. Willa couldn't sleep. Not really. When she closed her eyes, she saw that figure in the woods. The way it stood so still, as if time didn't matter to it. Like it had been there long before them, and would still be there long after. Sometime just before dawn, she heard footsteps outside. Not hurried, not soft, just walking. She wrapped herself in her cloak and slipped out into the snow, her breath clouding the air. The footsteps weren't fresh. They'd been left a while ago, but she could still follow them. They led toward the chapel. She crept closer, staying in the shadows of the buildings. The door was open slightly. Light flickered from inside. She stepped up quietly and peeked through the crack. There was someone standing by the fire. Not Elsbeth. Not Thomas. Someone else. Cloaked. Hooded. Still. Willa's heart thudded in her ears. She couldn't move. The figure reached out, slowly, as if feeling the heat. Then it pulled something from inside its cloak. A bundle, wrapped in cloth. It set it down gently beside the hearth. Then, without a word, it turned and walked out the back. Willa burst through the door moments later, racing to the fire. The bundle was still there. She hesitated, then knelt and opened it. Inside were pieces of bark. Dry. Cured. Fire-ready. More wood than they'd seen in days. She looked back toward the door the figure had vanished through. No footprints in the snow. Only the wind. Willa didn't speak of what she'd seen right away. Not because she feared disbelief, though she knew it would come, but because something about the moment felt too fragile to explain, as though describing it might undo it. She waited until sunrise, sitting by the hearth, feeding the fire with the mysterious bark. It caught easily, burning hot and clean. No one asked where the wood had come from, but many noticed the change. The warmth drew villagers in like moths to a lantern, and for the first time in days, there was quiet comfort. When Elsbeth arrived that morning, Willa finally told her. "I saw someone," she whispered, careful not to wake the baby sleeping on a straw mat nearby. "Not a villager. Not someone I know." Elsbeth listened, her eyes narrowing as Willa described the cloak, the slow steps, the bundle placed beside the hearth. There were no prints, Willa finished, and they didn't speak. Just left the wood. Elsbeth didn't answer for a while. Instead, she sat down slowly, eyes fixed on the flames. Then she spoke, her voice barely above a breath. "They say there are spirits of the old woods," she began. "Not ghosts. Not demons. just watchers. Things that once lived before people claimed the land, before farms and fences and names. Some say they sleep in the roots of trees during warm years and wake only when the world forgets how to listen. Willa felt the chill run through her. You believe that? I didn't used to, Elsbeth said. Not until this winter. Still, despite the mystery, or perhaps because of it, the chapel fire became the center of village life over the next few days. More would appear by the hearth each night. Small bundles wrapped in bark or cloth, sometimes with dried berries or pine cones tucked beside them. Always placed gently, always without a sound. Some refused to speak of it at all, fearing that too much attention would scare it away. Others began to leave small gifts in return, woven straw dolls, carved trinkets, a few acorns placed near the fire as quiet thanks. But not all were comforted. Bram was growing restless. He paced more than he worked. He stopped going to the forest and started speaking in low tones with those who distrusted the strange visitor. It's not normal, he said one night to a small circle in the corner of the chapel. We don't know who or what is leaving that wood. Could be drawing us in, making us soft, dependent. What would you have us do? Thomas asked. Track it. Find it. We need to know. Willa didn't speak, but she felt the knot in her stomach tighten. Something about the way Bram said it, instead of they disturbed her. Elsbeth was firmer this time. If you go into those woods looking for something, you may find more than you want. We should be grateful we've been given anything at all. But Bram didn't listen. That night, he and two others, Reynard and Joss, slipped out into the dark. They didn't take torches, hoping not to alert their quarry. They walked by moonlight, thick cloaks wrapped tight, blades at their belts. Willow waited up, unable to sleep. Something in her bones told her they'd make a mistake. By dawn, only Reynard returned. His face was pale, lips cracked from cold, eyes wide. He couldn't speak for a long time. They gave him water, wrapped him in furs, waited. When he finally talked, his voice shook. We followed the path, he whispered. We saw the same signs, the symbols. One tree had a handprint in sap, still sticky, not like anything I've seen. Too big, fingers too long. What happened to Bram? Elsbeth asked gently. We lost him. He went ahead when he thought he saw movement. Joss followed. I stayed behind. He looked down at his hands, trembling slightly. I heard them scream, but only once. Short, then nothing. No one moved. I ran, Reynard admitted. I didn't look back. They searched for 2 days. Found nothing. No bodies. No tracks. Not even a broken branch. Just the endless hush of snow. That was when the mood in the village changed. Before, the fear had been shadowed by awe, softened by the mystery of kindness. Now it sharpened. Questions festered. Some wondered if the visitor in the night was a warning, not a gift. Others feared they had offended something they didn't understand. And still, more firewood appeared each night, along with bundles of herbs, sticks of resin, and even dried mushrooms. Willa stood vigil many nights, hoping for another glimpse. But the firebringer, whoever or whatever they were, did not return in form. Just an offering. Then, on the 7th night after Bram vanished, something new happened. A strange knocking came at the chapel door. 3 knocks. Slow. Hollow. Not frantic. Not strong. Just patient. Everyone inside froze. Elsbeth stood and walked to the door. She paused, hand hovering over the handle. Don't, someone whispered. She opened it anyway. The night air rushed in, cold and brittle. The snow had started again, tiny flakes that shimmered like ash. There was no one there, but on the steps sat a bundle. Not firewood this time. Cloth. A dark, heavy wrap tied in twine. Elsbeth knelt, picked it up gently, carried it inside. Willa felt her breath hitch. They placed the bundle on the table. Slowly, Elsbeth untied the twine. Inside, carefully wrapped in layers of soft moss and wool, was a hand. Human. Clean. Cold. Joss's ring still clung to one finger. Someone gasped. Agnes began to cry softly. Elsbeth rewrapped it without a word and carried it to the back room of the chapel. No one slept that night. No one spoke of the gift, but the fire still burned, and the wind outside howled longer than before. The days that followed moved like slow, frozen breath. Time didn't pass in hours anymore. It crept forward in whispers of wind, in the soft cracking of ice on the well bucket, in the way people paused before opening a door, as if expecting something to be waiting on the other side. The firewood still came, even after Joss's hand, even after the chapel felt less like a shelter and more like a place under observation. Each night, another bundle would appear. Now it wasn't just wood. Sometimes it was dried meat, strips of sinew with the faint scent of juniper, or tightly packed balls of herbs tied with thread. The gifts were helpful, always useful, but no one took them with the same comfort as before. They accepted them like offerings from something sacred and untouchable, something that didn't speak their language but still understood their need. People stopped asking questions out loud, but they whispered. Willa heard them. They're feeding us like stray dogs. What if it's a test? What if we're being watched to see who takes and who gives? We should leave something better in return. Show we're thankful. That last idea caught on. Small piles began to gather near the hearth. Rough-spun scarves, children's drawings made in charcoal on scraps of bark, a tiny loaf of bread made from ground chestnuts. Even Bram's old pendant was laid down. His sister left it there silently one evening, eyes swollen from crying, fingers trembling. Willa noticed something else. The gifts they received began to change. A wooden whistle, a stitched leather pouch with symbols sewn into it, a small bone comb carved with vines. Things no one in the village had made. No one claimed to understand the symbols either, though Elsbeth studied them by candlelight, tracing them softly with her finger. "They're old," she murmured one night when Willa asked. "Older than this village, older than our church, older than any of our books." Willa leaned closer. "So who's leaving them?" Elsbeth didn't answer right away. Then, "Someone who remembers more than we do." And just like that, it was back to silence. One evening, a storm rolled in heavier than any before. Not with loud thunder, but with the kind of wind that made the trees creak like bones and snow that hit sideways, pelting the walls and windows like tiny stones. Everyone huddled inside. The chapel was full. Nearly all the remaining villagers had gathered, blankets pulled around shoulders, eyes turned toward the crackling fire, as if it were the last light on earth. Then the howling stopped, not gradually, all at once. It was as if the world outside had inhaled and held its breath. The silence was louder than the storm. And then, from the back wall of the chapel, where no door existed, came a soft tapping. 1. Pause. 2. Pause. 3. Everyone turned. There was nothing to see. No window. No shadow. Just the wooden wall, unmoving. But then the smell came, sharp, like crushed pine needles and cold iron. Willa felt her heartbeat in her throat. Elsbeth rose and walked slowly toward the wall, hand outstretched. Her fingers brushed the wood, and a knot in the timber split open. It didn't crack like breaking, it unfolded. A small gap formed, just wide enough for her to reach through. She looked at Willa, and without words, Willa stepped closer, clutching the candle she'd been holding. Elsbeth reached in, pulled out a bundle. Again, not wood, not meat. Something wrapped in bark and bound with hair, long, dark, and braided like rope. She placed it on the table and unwrapped it slowly. Inside was a book, or something like one. Thin pages, but not paper. Something leathery, faintly translucent. The writing wasn't in any language they knew. The letters looked like spider legs and curling roots, woven together in ways that seemed to move if you stared too long. Willa turned away quickly. Elsbeth closed it, gently but firmly. She held it in both hands like it might crumble, then walked it to the chapel's far end and placed it beneath the altar. No one asked to see it again. The next day, something happened that hadn't occurred in nearly a month. The sun came out. Not fully, just a faint glow behind thin clouds. But it was enough to bring people blinking to the chapel door, shivering not from cold, but from the strange unfamiliarity of light. Children stepped out first, boots crunching in a thick snow, hands wrapped in wool mittens. Their laughter, though soft, was the first real joy the village had heard since autumn. But not everyone rejoiced. That morning, the village dogs were missing. All of them, gone without a sound. No paw prints, no signs of struggle, just empty spaces where they usually lay curled up beside the chapel hearth or at the feet of their families. Willa noticed at first when she went to feed her old hound, Moss. His blanket was there. His collar lay beside the door. But the dog was gone. Elsbeth's expression when she heard this was unreadable. She only nodded, then turned and looked toward the woods. "The forest takes what it's owed," she said. Some began whispering again, this time louder. "This is a warning." "No, it's a trade. We left them gifts. They left us books." What if the dogs were protecting us, and they took them so they could come in? That night, no one slept easily. Even a fire didn't feel as warm. The next bundle brought more than a gift. It brought a voice. Willa was the one who found it. She had gone outside early, before first light, unable to sleep, hoping the cold would clear her thoughts. She walked to the hearth door, and there it was, a bundle, and a voice. Not out loud, not in the air, in her head, not words, just a feeling, like a question, a presence. It made her knees go weak. She reached down, hands trembling, and picked up the bundle. Inside, wrapped in thin leather, was a small pendant. Stone, dark and smooth, with a spiral carved into its center. The moment she touched it, the presence faded. But something had shifted. She held it tight and walked back into the chapel. When Elsbeth saw her, she stood quickly. Willa didn't speak for several minutes. Then, finally, she said quietly, "They're not just watching us." Elsbeth nodded slowly. "I know." Willa opened her hand and showed her the pendant. "They're choosing." Elsbeth took a breath. "Then we need to decide who we are before they decide for us." And outside, the snow began to fall again, heavier this time. The wind rose like breath drawn deep, and something unseen watched, waiting just beyond the tree lean. By the time the sun vanished again, a blanket of silence had settled over the village, not just outside, but inside the chapel too. Even the children, who had grown used to laughing softly or playing quietly in the corners, now sat near their parents in silence, their wide eyes flickering toward the door or the windows every few minutes. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was anticipation, like they were waiting for something everyone could feel but couldn't name. Willa held the pendant tighter every day. She kept it on a string around her neck, hidden under her tunic. The spiral carved into the stone seemed to pulse with warmth sometimes. Not heat, not like fire, but a strange kind of energy that made her feel awake even when she hadn't slept. She hadn't told anyone else what the voice had felt like. How it hadn't just spoken to her. It had known her. Known things about her she had never said aloud. Memories, fears, names of people she hadn't seen since childhood. The presence in that moment hadn't been cruel or kind, just aware. Like the wind or the sea. Elsbeth had become even quieter since the book appeared. She spent more time near the altar now, lighting candles, whispering prayers no one else recognized. Not prayers from their books. Older ones. Older than anything passed down by their families. She didn't explain what she was doing, but the others didn't question her. There was something about the way she moved now that made it feel like she knew more, something heavy and ancient pressing on her shoulders. Willa could see it in the way her hands shook when she held the book, or how she looked toward the forest with equal parts reverence and dread. Then came the deer. It was the first sign of real life in weeks. A large stag, antlers wide and proud, stood just beyond the chapel's edge near the snow-covered grove. Everyone saw it. It didn't run when the doors opened. It didn't blink or flinch as they gathered behind Willa and Bram and Elsbeth, staring. It was waiting. At its hooves lay something strange, a circle made of stones and pine cones, arranged so carefully it couldn't have been natural. In the center of the circle was a bundle wrapped in bark. Elsbeth stepped forward first, but when she moved, the deer turned, slowly, and vanished between the trees. The bundle was warm in her hands, like it had just been placed there moments before. Inside was a doll. A small figure made of straw, tied with red thread, and in its chest was a tiny piece of bone. The moment Elsbeth held it up, a gust of wind slammed into the chapel doors, so hard they flew open and stayed that way. No snow blew in, no air rushed out, just stillness. And again, that sense of something watching. Later that night, while the others slept, Willa asked Elsbeth if she thought it was still safe to stay. Elsbeth didn't answer at first. Then she said, "They don't want to hurt us, but they're reminding us who came first." Willa frowned. "Who?" Elsbeth looked at her, tired eyes glinting. "The ones who never left." Willa didn't know what to say, so she said nothing. Outside, the wind had died again. The forest looked like it was holding its breath. But inside, something was moving. The next morning, the youngest child in the village, Ingrid, barely 4, woke up saying she had dreamed of a woman made of roots and snow. Her parents brushed it off. Children always dreamed strange things in winter. But Ingrid kept insisting. The woman had spoken to her, asked her to bring the spiral stone. Willa felt her blood run cold. Ingrid had never seen the pendant, never touched it, yet she described it in perfect detail, even the scratch across the lower edge where Willa had dropped it days earlier. That night, Willa didn't sleep. She sat near the fire, clutching the pendant in her hand, staring into the flames as they danced and popped and hissed. The chapel was quiet, too quiet. Even the mice that used to scurry between the beams had gone silent. At some point, she wasn't sure when, she looked up and saw Elsbeth standing at the back of the room, holding the book. The leather pages were open, but Elsbeth wasn't reading. She was listening, her head tilted slightly, as though hearing something no one else could. The flames flickered, casting her face in shifting shadows, and for the first time, Willa saw a flicker of fear in the old woman's expression. She closed the book and walked toward Willa. "They're waking up," she whispered. "The forest." Willa swallowed hard. Waking up for what? Elsbeth hesitated. To remember, and Willa knew they were running out of time. 2 days later, Bram disappeared. He had gone out with a few others to collect snow from the well and bring in the last of the frozen vegetables buried beneath the root cellar. He had taken the path near the trees, whistling like he always did. They found the vegetables. They found the snow buckets. They even found his boots, standing upright near the edge of the forest, footprints ending right in front of them. But no Bram. No sign of a struggle. No blood. Nothing disturbed. Just the boots. And silence. Panic set in fast. Families huddled together, refusing to leave the chapel. Some cried. Some shouted. Some demanded that Elsbeth make it stop. But she only looked toward the altar, where the book now rested beneath the spiral pendant, and said softly, "It was never up to me." Willa sat by the hearth, numb. She couldn't cry, couldn't think. Her friend, her closest friend, was gone. Like the dogs, like the sound of birds, like the light from the sky. Taken, it seemed, by something they could not see or understand. But the worst part? She knew, in her heart, that Bram had chosen to go. She had seen something in his face that morning. A strange calm, like he knew something the rest of them didn't. Like he had heard the same whisper she had. Like he wasn't afraid. Willa stared into the fire for hours that night. And when sleep finally took her, it came with a dream. She stood in the snow, barefoot, holding the spiral stone. All around her were tall trees, their branches heavy with frost. In the distance, a figure moved slowly toward her. A woman with a crown of ice and eyes like frozen water. The same woman Ingrid had described. The woman reached out, not to take the stone, to give her something. And when Willa opened her hands in the dream, she was holding a key, not to a door, but to something older, something buried, something waiting. She woke with a gasp just as the morning light turned the snow outside a pale shade of blue. And in that quiet moment, before the others stirred, she knew. The forest was no longer outside. It had already come in. The frost had crept further inside than anyone had noticed. It wasn't just the windows, now glazed over with delicate ice patterns. The stone walls of the chapel had grown colder, their surfaces weeping faint beads of moisture that turned to frost overnight. Wooden beams, once warm from the hearth's glow, now held a strange chill that seemed to sink deeper each evening. But no one said it aloud, as if naming it would invite it further in. People had stopped talking about spring. Hope was a luxury they couldn't afford anymore. Instead, they clung to rituals. Every morning, Willa lit the same 3 candles by the altar. Elsbeth whispered her prayers to the corners of the room where shadows gathered. Parents told their children old stories about the sun, about warmth, about the way the ground once softened beneath bare feet. And they kept watching the tree line. Always the trees. Silent, unmoving, but never forgotten. There had been no more disappearances since Bram, but the air inside the chapel had changed. It felt heavier, like the walls were straining to keep something out or in. Elsbeth spent longer each night with the book. She would read by firelight, lips moving without sound, her brow tight with worry. Willa often watched her, unsure if she should ask the questions gathering in her own chest. Why hadn't they left sooner? What was the book really saying? Why had the forest gone quiet only after the snow came? But she never asked. She was afraid of the answers. Then came the scratching. At first, no one else heard it. Faint, barely there. A tiny sound beneath the floorboards or behind a stone. Like a mouse, but not quite. The rhythm was too careful. It would come at dusk, just as the last bit of daylight died. A faint scratch, followed by stillness. Then another, always in threes. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Willa told herself it was her imagination. But on the third night, she saw Elsbeth freeze when it happened. The old woman closed the book slowly, eyes narrowed, and turned her head toward the far wall. "You hear it too," Willa whispered. Elsbeth nodded. She didn't explain, but she didn't deny it. The scratching continued for 5 more nights. Then, without warning, it stopped, and something worse took its place. That night, the fire wouldn't light. No matter how much kindling they used, how many sparks Bram's cousin struck with flint, the hearth remained cold. They tried burning herbs, dried moss, even oil-soaked cloth. Nothing caught. The logs stayed black and damp, as if they had just been pulled from the river. Elsbeth stood by the fireplace, frowning deeply. "It's not the wood," she said. "It's this place." Someone scoffed behind her. "That's nonsense." But no one tried to argue further, because they all felt it. That absence, like the warmth had been taken. The chapel grew colder by the hour. Breath turned to mist indoors. Skin turned pale, lips cracked. Children cried softly under wool blankets, and the elderly huddled near the center of the room, where the cold came just a little slower. Willa lay awake that night, with the pendant pressed tightly against her chest. Her thoughts drifted to Bram, where he could be, whether he was alive, whether he'd chosen this path or been stolen by it, and she wondered if she would be next. That was the first night she saw them. They appeared just past midnight, near the farthest window. Figures, tall and still, not animals, not people, shapes of frost and wind, blurred around the edges like a dream. They didn't move, they didn't blink, but they watched, not just the chapel. They watched her. Willa couldn't move, couldn't scream. She just lay still, eyes wide, heart hammering in her chest. The longer she stared, the more the cold spread through her limbs. It wasn't just fear. It was them, draining her inch by inch. Then, one of the figures raised a hand and traced a spiral onto the window's frost. She didn't remember falling asleep, but when she woke at dawn, the window was clear. The frost was gone. The spiral had vanished. No one else had seen it, or so she thought, until Elsbeth handed her something. A slip of parchment torn from the book. On it was the same spiral, drawn with what looked like ash and bone. "They're not here to harm you," Elsbeth said softly. "Not yet." Willa held the parchment with trembling fingers. "Then what do they want?" Elsbeth looked out the window, eyes unfocused. To be remembered. That was the beginning of the story she finally told. Long ago, before the village, before even the chapel, the forest had been home to something else. A people who didn't build walls or write books. They lived with the land, not on it. They honored the old ways, left offerings for the wind and the trees, and believed the cold was not a curse, but a season with its own voice. But when the settlers came, they brought their own gods, their own rules. They built over sacred places, burned old totems, mocked the rites they didn't understand. And so, the forest remembered, not with fire, with silence, with snow, and with forgetting. They were buried, Elsbeth said, not in graves, but in memory, erased. Until now, Willa stared at her. "So they're punishing us?" "No," Elsbeth's voice was almost kind. "They're reminding us." Of what? She didn't say. But that night, another figure disappeared. A man named Joran, quiet and kind, known for carving wooden animals for the children. He had gone to the back room to fetch a blanket. He never returned. They found the door open, and a single wooden deer carved into the snow. No footsteps, no trail, just a figure, watching, waiting. Willa sat near the cold hearth, the spiral pendant resting against her skin, and realized she couldn't wait for spring anymore. Spring wasn't coming, not until the forest was done speaking, and right now it had only begun. The village was no longer just a collection of homes. It had become a fortress of fear. The once lively chatter by the fireside had dwindled to whispers filled with suspicion and unease. Everyone felt the weight of the unseen eyes, the quiet breath of the forest pressing against their skin even when the wind was still. Willa found herself caught between the old and the new, between what the forest demanded and what the village elders insisted. Some believed the disappearances were punishments for their neglect of tradition. Others whispered about curses or demons, stories passed down but forgotten in daylight. Joran's disappearance was the breaking point for many. His absence was a stark reminder that no one was safe, not even the kind-hearted woodcarver who had brought a bit of joy to the children. Mothers clutched their little ones tighter at night, and fathers sharpened axes not just for the winter hunt, but as a desperate shield against the unknown. Yet, amid the growing fear, some began to question. Old Tomas, the village smith, grumbled about how the villagers had abandoned the old ways. He claimed that offerings had stopped, that prayers were half-hearted, and that the forest spirits had grown restless because of this neglect. Tomas tried to rally a group to return to the ancient rites, gatherings in the deep woods, offerings of bread and salt, the lighting of bonfires to honor the cold season's power. Willa listened but hesitated. She didn't fully trust Tomas, nor did she completely believe in the old stories. But she couldn't deny the truth in his words. The cold had come with more than ice. It brought silence, absence, and a creeping despair. Meanwhile, Elsbeth grew quieter, more withdrawn. Her eyes, once sharp and piercing, now often glazed over, staring into a distance no one else could see. Willa often found her by the chapel's altar, hands folded tightly over the ancient book, whispering fragments of words no one understood. One evening, as snow piled heavier outside, Elsbeth finally spoke. "The forest is speaking, but it is not our language. We must listen with more than ears." Willa pressed her for meaning, but the old woman only shook her head. "Patience," she said. "The answers come in time." But time was something they didn't have. The villagers began to see shapes moving just beyond the tree line. Shadows flickering between trunks, glimmers of white against the dark pines. Hunters sent out to track game returned with stories of silent figures standing still like statues, watching them with eyes that gleamed like frost. One such hunter, a young man named Arlen, came back one night with frostbite and a wild look in his eyes. He spoke of voices, soft and low, calling his name through the wind. He swore he saw the figures step closer, reaching out with hands made of snow and ice. The village council debated fiercely whether to send out a search party or to seal themselves indoors until spring. Some argued for fighting, for facing the forest's wrath with steel and courage. Others feared that any confrontation would only anger whatever lingered in the shadows. Willa found herself torn. Bram's disappearance haunted her, a ghost she couldn't shake. She felt the pull to venture beyond the safe walls, to uncover the truth hidden in the frozen trees. But she also feared what she might find, or what might find her. In the meantime, strange happenings unsettled daily life. Food stores began to dwindle, not only because of the harsh winter, but because some believed the forest was stealing from their caches. Pots left on the fire would freeze solid overnight. Water turned to ice before it could boil. Even the animals seemed restless, their usual tracks disrupted or completely vanished. Children, once carefree despite the cold, grew quiet and distant. They spoke less and spent more time huddled indoors, eyes darting toward the windows, as if expecting something to appear. And then there were the dreams. Willa had them almost every night. Visions of frozen landscapes where voices whispered secrets in a language she could almost understand. She saw Bram walking through endless snow, following a path lit by faint spirals glowing on the ground. But each time she reached out to him, he would vanish like mist. Elsbeth's dreams were darker, filled with shadowy figures that spoke in riddles and warnings. She muttered fragments of old prayers upon waking, her fingers tracing the pendant around Willa's neck as if seeking comfort. The village's fragile hope was fraying, stretched thin by cold, fear, and unanswered questions. Then, one evening, a messenger arrived from a neighboring settlement, a place far enough to be safe but close enough to matter. He spoke of a similar winter, a similar silence, and of people disappearing without a trace. Willa gathered the villagers and shared the news. The forest shadow was not isolated, it was spreading. That realization brought no comfort. If the cold was a message, its meaning was clear. The world beyond their little village was changing. The old ways, the fragile balance with nature, was breaking. And somewhere in the endless white, the figures waited, watching, remembering, demanding. The only question that remained was what price the villagers would pay to survive the brutal winter, and whether survival meant something more than just staying alive. As the wind howled outside and the night deepened, Willa clutched the spiral pendant and made a silent vow. She would find Bram. She would uncover the secrets buried beneath the ice and shadow. And she would confront whatever waited in the frozen forest, no matter the cost. But the forest was patient, and it was hungry, and it was far from done. The days dragged on like the heavy snow that blanketed the village, muffling sound and dulling movement. Every morning, Willa woke to a world glazed in white, the sky a pale gray ceiling that pressed down on her thoughts. The forest loomed on the horizon, a wall of black pines dusted with frost, silent and watchful. Despite the growing dread, life in the village struggled to continue. The farmers huddled indoors, their hands raw from cold, repairing tools and weaving blankets. The children's laughter was a rare gift, a fragile thread of warmth amid the creeping chill. But beneath the surface, an unspoken tension wound tighter every day. Willa's mind was occupied not just with survival, but with Bram, her brother, taken or lost to the forest's grasp. She spent hours studying the ancient book Elsbeth guarded so closely. The pages were brittle and filled with strange symbols, tales of the old people who once lived in harmony with the land and the cold. But there were warnings, too, of silence that devours, of shadows that hunger for forgetting. One afternoon, she found a passage that made her heart race. The spiral marks the path between worlds. Those who follow may find both salvation and oblivion. But beware the choice, for the forest does not grant mercy to the lost. The spiral, the same symbol the figures traced on the frosted window, the same Elsbeth had drawn on parchment. Willa's fingers trembled as she traced the faded lines. What path? And where did it lead? Elsbeth noticed her interest and finally spoke more openly. The spiral is an ancient sign of passage, she said quietly, between our world and the realm beneath the frost. The old ones believed the cold was not death, but a sleep, a pause before awakening. Willa looked up, eyes wide. So Bram, he's not dead? Elsbeth hesitated. I do not know, but the forest chooses its own. Sometimes, it takes those who listen too closely. Others, it leaves behind. The weight of Elsbeth's words settled over Willa like a stone. The thought that Bram might still be out there, trapped in some frozen dream or lost to an eternal sleep, gave her a flicker of hope and a surge of fear. Meanwhile, the village was fracturing under the strain. Tomas and his followers pushed harder for a return to the old ways. They gathered deep in the woods at night, leaving small offerings, bits of bread, carved wooden tokens, prayers whispered to the wind. Some villagers joined them, desperate for any chance to appease the restless spirits. Others, like the village council, viewed this with suspicion and dread. They feared Tomas's rituals might provoke something worse. Arguments flared around the hearths, families divided over faith and fear. Willa often found herself caught between these factions. She understood Tomas's desire to act, to reclaim some control in the face of the unknown. But she also worried that the village was stirring forces it did not understand. One cold evening, a messenger arrived from the neighboring settlement again, bringing news that chilled everyone deeper than the frost. "They vanished," the man said grimly. "Whole families gone. No sign of struggle. No footprints in the snow. Just empty homes and silence." The village elder's face grew pale. The forest spreads its hunger. Fear twisted tighter around Willa's heart. If it was spreading, there might be no escape. No safe place beyond the ice. That night, she dreamed of the figures again, the tall, pale shapes with faces blurred like mist. They called her name softly, their voices weaving through the wind like a song she couldn't forget. They beckoned her to follow, to walk the spiral path beneath the frost. She woke with a start, the pendant cold against her skin. The dream had felt too real, too urgent. She knew she couldn't stay hidden forever. But the question remained, what awaited her beyond the trees? And what price would she pay to find out? Back in the village, subtle changes began to appear. The snow, once soft and powdery, turned crusty and sharp, snapping underfoot like brittle glass. The animals grew scarce, their tracks disappearing overnight. Even the stars seemed dimmer, swallowed by the thickening clouds. People began speaking in hushed tones of the sleeping ones. Ancient spirits said to roam beneath the snow, waiting for the right moment to awaken. Old wives' tales, many said, but there was a new edge of truth behind the stories now. One evening, as Willa stood at the edge of the village, staring into the dense forest, she saw a faint glow flickering between the trees. It was pale like moonlight caught in frost, and it pulsed slowly, as if breathing. Her breath caught. Was it a signal? A warning? Or a call? She wrapped her cloak tighter and took a step forward. Behind her, the village settled into uneasy silence. The winter had only just begun, and the forest was ready to reveal its secrets, whether they were meant to be found or not. The glow between the trees flickered again, gentle but insistent, like a heartbeat pulsing in the cold darkness. Willa's breath came in shallow clouds as she hesitated, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and something deeper, a stubborn hope she dared not voice aloud. Every instinct urged her to turn back to the warmth of the village, to the familiar faces wrapped in furs and whispers of safety. Yet, the light seemed to call her, weaving its way in her thoughts like a thread she could not unravel. Slowly, she stepped forward, the snow crunching softly beneath her boots. The forest loomed tall and silent, the pine trees standing like watchful sentinels, their dark branches heavy with frost. As Willa moved deeper, the air grew colder, sharper, each breath a stabbing reminder of the harsh winter that refused to relent. She remembered the warnings from Elsbeth, from Tomas, from every trembling voice she'd heard in the village. The forest was not just a place of wood and snow. It was a living, breathing entity, ancient and patient. It held stories written in ice and shadow, stories that spoke of loss, survival, and something older, something hungry. The glow flickered again, closer now, revealing a strange spiral etched into the bark of a towering pine. The lines shimmered faintly, as if alive beneath the frost. Willa traced the symbol with trembling fingers. This was the spiral, the path Elsbeth had spoken of, the boundary between worlds. Her heart hammered in her chest. Was this the path to Bram, or to something darker? Suddenly, a sharp crack echoed through the silence. Willa froze, every muscle taut. Somewhere in the distance, the snow shifted as if disturbed by a heavy weight. She strained her eyes, but the darkness seemed to swallow everything. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice barely a whisper. No answer came, only the cold wind weaving through the trees, carrying with it a whisper of something almost like a sigh. Her courage faltered, yet she knew she could not turn back now. Bram was out there, somewhere beneath this frozen wilderness, and if there was even a chance to bring him home, she had to take it. Further ahead, the spiral on the tree seemed to pulse with light. Willa reached out again and found herself drawn through a veil of frost that felt thinner than air. She stepped through, and the world shifted. The trees around her grew taller, more twisted, their branches like frozen fingers stretching toward the sky. The snow beneath her feet was deeper, softer, untouched by footprints. The air smelled different, colder, almost metallic, and tinged with an unplaceable scent like old wood and distant memories. Then, faintly at first, she heard it, the soft sound of footsteps, light, hurried, echoing through the stillness. Willa's pulse quickened. She moved cautiously, following the sound between the trees. Ahead, she glimpsed a figure, small and hunched, moving carefully among the shadows. It was a child, wrapped in ragged furs, eyes wide and shining like stars. "Bram," Willa called softly. The child froze, turning slowly to face her. The pale light revealed a face marked by frostbite and fear, but unmistakably Bram's. He did not speak, only reached out a trembling hand. "Come with me," Willa whispered, tears burning her eyes. "We'll get you home." But as Bram took her hand, the forest seemed to shudder. The shadows thickened, twisting into shapes, tall, slender figures, their faces blurred and pale as the moon. They moved silently, closing the space between Willa and Bram. "Who are you?" Willa demanded, her voice stronger now, despite the fear gnawing at her. One of the figures stepped forward, eyes glowing faintly with an icy blue light. "We are the Watchers," it said in a voice like the wind through dead leaves. "Guardians of a spiral, keepers of the winter's secret." Willa's breath caught. "Why did you take him? What do you want?" The Watcher's gaze did not waver. "The balance must be kept. The forest gives and the forest takes. Bram is part of the old world now, between the sleep and the waking." She looked down at Bram, who clutched her hand tightly, eyes wide but silent. "Please," Willa pleaded, "he's my brother. He doesn't belong here." The Watcher's expression softened for a moment. If such a pale, ghostly face could show softness. "There's a choice," it said. "The spiral marks the way. Return with him, and the winter's shadow will follow. Stay, and the path may yet offer light." Willa's mind raced. The spiral was a doorway, a path between worlds. But which way led home? Which way led to safety? Before she could answer, the forest around them grew darker, the cold intensifying as the wind howled through the pines. The Watchers faded back into the shadows, leaving Willa and Bram alone in the deep silence. Her heart pounded with urgency. The village, the people she loved, all waited for her return. But what awaited them if she led Bram back? Would the shadow follow and swallow everything? And if she stayed, what price would she pay for choosing the unknown? The path ahead was unclear, but Willa knew one thing. The brutal winter was more than a season. It was a force, ancient and unyielding, demanding a reckoning. She tightened her grip on Bram's hand and took a deep breath, stepping forward into the unknown. Back at the village, the air hung heavy with unease. The council gathered again, voices low but urgent. Tomas pushed for more offerings, more rituals to placate the restless spirits, warning that the forest's hunger was far from satisfied. Others called for strength in arms, for watchmen to patrol the edge of the woods, to stand guard against whatever lurked in the cold. But Elsbeth, seated quietly near the fire, whispered a warning that chilled the room more than the winter's bite. "The forest is watching," she said. "It is waiting for a choice, a balance to be struck. But choices made in fear can summon darkness deeper than the cold." The villagers exchanged uneasy glances. The forest's mystery had grown from a story to a force that threatened their very existence. And somewhere beyond the trees, Willa's footsteps stirred the snow, carrying with them the hope and fear of a world caught between light and shadow. The brutal winter was far from over, and its secrets were just beginning to unravel. Willa moved through the forest with Bram's small hand tight in hers, her eyes straining to pierce the heavy twilight that settled like a shroud over the snow-covered ground. Every step felt heavier than the last, weighed down by the cold and by the endless questions spinning through her mind. The trees around them seemed to lean closer, their frost-covered branches creaking softly in the cold breeze. whispers of secrets long buried beneath ice and shadow. Bram's breath came in shallow puffs, his cheeks flushed with cold, but his grip was steady. He didn't speak, not yet. Perhaps he was too afraid or too confused to find the words. Or maybe the silence was the forest's way of holding its breath, waiting. Willa's thoughts drifted back to the villagers, her family, her friends, locked inside their homes, bracing against the brutal winter that had lasted longer than anyone could remember. They whispered prayers into the dark, told old stories to keep the cold at bay. But outside, the snow continued to pile up, blanketing the land in white, muting life and hope alike. She couldn't help but wonder what was waiting for them at the end of this path. The Watchers had spoken of choices of balance. But what if no choice was truly safe? What if the forest demanded more than she was willing to give? The ground beneath them shifted subtly, a faint hum that thrummed in her bones. Willa looked down to see the snow rippling like water, faint blue light pulsing beneath the surface. The spiral, the same symbol she had seen on the tree, glowed beneath her feet, a path winding through the ice. Bram tugged at her sleeve, his eyes wide. Willa, look. Ahead, the trees parted into a small clearing. In the center, a circle of stones rose from the snow, ancient and weathered, half buried beneath moss and frost. The spiral was carved deep into the largest stone, its lines glowing with the same eerie light. Willa stepped closer, her breath catching. This was no ordinary place. It felt sacred, alive with a power that both frightened and called to her. Suddenly, the wind shifted, carrying voices on its breath. Soft at first, then growing louder, whispers of names, of stories, of lives long forgotten beneath the winter's weight. Bram, Willa whispered heart tight. Do you hear that? The boy nodded, clutching her hand. It's like people talking. The voices seemed to come from the stones themselves, stories echoing through time. Willa felt the weight of history press against her. The lives of peasants who had walked these lands centuries before, struggling through winters just like this one. They had faced hunger, cold, and fear, yet somehow survived. Her mind filled with questions. How had they endured such brutal winters? What secrets had they hidden beneath the ice? And could those old ways still help her village survive the long darkness that stretched ahead? As Willa reached out to touch the stone, a sudden crack echoed through the clearing. The air shimmered, and from the shadows stepped a figure, a woman draped in furs, eyes bright with fire and wisdom. She moved with a grace that seemed to belong to the forest itself, her voice steady despite the cold. You found the heart of the spiral, the woman said, her gaze fixed on Willa. Few have come this far and lived to tell it. Willa swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the moment. Who are you? I am Maeve, guardian of the old ways, the woman replied. I watch over the boundary between the living and the sleeping. The winter is not just cold, it's a test, a challenge to those who live beneath its shadow. Willa glanced at Bram, whose eyes never left Maeve. My brother, he's lost to the forest. Can you help me bring him back? Maeve's gaze softened. Bram walks between worlds now. The spiral marked his passage, but the path home is never certain. The forest demands a price. Willa's heart pounded. What kind of price? Maeve hesitated, then reached into her cloak, pulling out a small wooden charm carved in the shape of a spiral. She handed it to Willa. This will guide you, but it cannot protect you from what you must face. The forest tests the soul, fear, hope, love. Only one can lead you through. Willa accepted the charm, feeling its warmth against her cold fingers. I'll do whatever it takes. Maeve nodded. Good. But know this, the forest is not just a place of snow and silence. It is alive, filled with spirits who remember the old world. Some are kind, others less so. From the shadows, a low growl broke the stillness. Willa's eyes darted to the edge of the clearing, where a pair of glowing eyes watched them from behind a tree. The figure moved closer, a massive wolf, its coat shimmering with frost, breath steaming in the cold air. Bram clung to Willa, but Maeve stepped forward, raising a hand. The wolf hesitated, then bowed its head before retreating into the darkness. The forest creatures are part of the test too, Maeve said. Trust the signs, but beware the traps. Willa's mind swirled with questions and doubts, but she knew there was no turning back. The spiral had pulled her here for a reason. Bram's fate, the village's survival, depended on what she did next. As they prepared to leave the clearing, Maeve's voice followed them. Remember, the winter's heart beats beneath the ice. The forest is patient, but it never forgets. Choose wisely, or all may be lost. Willa glanced at Bram, clutching the spiral charm. The weight of the coming days pressed down on her like the heavy snow. The brutal winter was more than a season. It was a reckoning. Back in the village, night had fallen. The flickering glow of fires cast long shadows against the snow-covered huts, but inside, unease festered. Tomas gathered his followers once more, chanting prayers to the old gods, calling for the cold to release its hold. Others barricaded their doors, sharpening blades and whispering fears of the shadows lurking beyond the edge of the woods. Elsbeth sat by the hearth, her eyes distant. She held an ancient scroll, worn and fragile, the ink faded with time. Her fingers traced the words slowly, as if searching for answers hidden in the script. The village elder's voice broke the silence. The forest watches. It waits for the spiral to turn. And when it does, the cold will claim what it has chosen. The room fell into a heavy silence, the weight of the unknown settling over everyone like the snow outside. Willa's journey was just beginning, but the forest's mysteries were deepening. With every step through the frost and shadow, the line between survival and surrender grew thinner. And somewhere beneath the ice, the winter's heart beat on, patient, relentless, waiting for the final choice. The chill in the village deepened as the night stretched on, and inside the homes, the faces of the peasants were pale and drawn. Every hearth burned low, smoke curling thinly toward the heavy wooden beams overhead. The cold wasn't just outside. It seemed to settle inside the bones of the people, seeping into their dreams and waking thoughts alike. Willa lay beside Bram in their small, shared bed, the thin wool blankets doing little to keep out the biting cold. She could hear his quiet breaths, steady but shallow, as if the chill tried to rob the warmth from his small body. Outside, the wind moaned like a lost spirit, rattling shutters and sending loose snowflakes tumbling down the street. In the dim glow of a tallow candle, Willa's fingers traced the spiral charm Maeve had given her. The wood felt warm, almost pulsing softly, as if it held a heartbeat beneath its surface. She closed her eyes, trying to still the storm of thoughts inside her. How could she face the forest again? The strange power in those stones, the glowing spiral beneath the snow, all of it seemed unreal. Yet the forest's pull was undeniable, and Bram's disappearance had left a hole in her life she couldn't ignore. Something deep inside told her this was only the beginning of a longer, darker journey. The village was not the same as it had been before the snow fell. Tomas and his band of followers grew restless, their prayers turning sharper, more desperate. Their eyes darted nervously toward the edge of the woods, as if expecting the forest itself to rise up and claim them. The ancient gods, once quietly respected, now felt like distant, angry forces watching from afar. Elsbeth, meanwhile, stayed close to the village elder, whispering to the faded scrolls and murmuring old chants. Her hands trembled as she read the worn text, searching for any hint of hope in the tangled history of their land. She had seen winters before, long, hard seasons that took lives and hope, but this one was different. This one held a cruelness that seemed almost unnatural. Outside the village, the snow continued to fall, thick and unyielding. The forest beyond the clearing where Willa had met Maeve seemed to pulse with life, the branches groaning under the weight of frost. The creatures of the woods, wolves, foxes, and animals Willa had never seen before, moved silently among the trees, their eyes glowing faintly like stars. Maeve's words echoed in Willa's mind. The forest was alive. It remembered. It tested the souls of those who dared to walk beneath its boughs. But what did the forest want? What price would it demand in exchange for Bram's return? The next morning, the village stirred with uneasy energy. People gathered near the great oak in the center, a tree ancient as the hills, its gnarled branches bare and stark against the gray sky. Tomas stood among them, his voice rising with fierce conviction. "We must hold to the old ways," he declared, "for only they can save us. The winter tests our faith, but it will break those who waver." A murmur of agreement passed through the crowd, though some faces held doubt. Fear had a way of dividing people, setting neighbor against neighbor. Willa listened, her heart torn. Tomas's words carried weight, but she knew the truth was more complicated. Faith alone wouldn't bring Bram back. Something else stirred beneath the snow and ice, something older and darker. Later that day, Willa sought out Elsbeth. The old woman sat by the hearth in her humble cottage, a bundle of herbs drying overhead. Her eyes were sharp despite her age, and when Willa showed her the spiral charm, Elsbeth's gaze deepened. "This symbol," Elsbeth whispered, tracing the carved lines, "belongs to the old magic, the magic of balance between light and dark, life and death. Few understand it now, but it was once the heart of our people's survival." Willa leaned closer. "Can it help Bram? Can it save him?" Elsbeth's eyes flickered with sorrow. "The spiral marks a passage, a door between worlds. Those who cross are changed. The charm can guide, yes, but it cannot protect from the trials ahead. The forest test is not just of body, but of spirit." Willa's grip tightened on the charm. "What kind of trials?" Elsbeth hesitated, then spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "You must face the shadows within yourself, your fears, your regrets, your hopes. Only by confronting these can you hope to bring Bram back." The room seemed to grow colder as the weight of those words settled between them. Willa swallowed hard. The journey she faced was not only through the forest darkness, but through the darkest parts of her own heart. That night, as the village settled beneath the starless sky, Willa prepared. She wrapped herself in furs, packed a small bundle with dried bread and salted meat, and tucked the spiral charm safely inside her cloak. Bram was out there, lost between worlds, and she would follow him through fire and shadow if she had to. Outside, the wind howled like a living thing. The forest called to her again, its voice both frightening and full of promise. Before leaving, Willa stopped by the village square, where Tomas stood alone, gazing toward the woods. Their eyes met briefly, and though neither spoke, Willa sensed the unspoken conflict between them. Faith versus fear, tradition versus the unknown. She stepped forward. "Tomas, the old ways may not be enough." He turned slowly, his face stern but tired. "And what would you suggest, Willa?" "That we trust in ghosts and forest spirits. I suggest we face the truth, that survival demands more than prayers. It demands courage to walk into the darkness." He regarded her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Then may the gods watch over you." Willa nodded, steeling herself against the cold. With Bram's hand still warm in her memory, she turned toward the forest's edge. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their shadows long and deep. The spiral charm pulsed faintly against her chest as she stepped forward, the snow crunching beneath her boots. Every sound was magnified in the quiet. The snap of a twig, the distant cry of a raven, the whisper of wind through the branches. The forest was watching, waiting for her to take the next step. As she ventured deeper, the air grew colder still, and the faint blue glow of the spiral beneath the snow reappeared, winding like a secret path just out of sight. Willa's heart raced. She did not know what lay ahead, what trials the forest would demand, or if she would find Bram at all. But one thing was certain. The brutal winter was far from over, and its hold on the land, and on her soul, was only just beginning to tighten. The deeper Willa stepped into the forest, the more the shadows seemed to close around her. Each breath hung heavy in the cold air, visible and fleeting, like tiny ghosts slipping away before they could take shape. The spiral charm pressed against her chest pulsed faintly, a steady heartbeat guiding her forward through the endless white. The trees towered overhead, skeletal arms reaching out like silent watchers, their branches creaking under the weight of snow. With every step, Willa's mind raced, not just with fear of what might be waiting in the forest's heart, but with the memories she couldn't shake. Bram's last smile, the warmth of his small hand in hers, the whispered promise she made to find him. Those moments were the fragile thread holding her courage together, even as the cold gnawed at her skin and the darkness stretched on like a living thing. The silence around her was broken only by the crunch of snow beneath her boots and the occasional distant howl of wolves. She remembered Elsbeth's warning. The forest tests not only the body, but the spirit. Willa wondered what trials awaited her. Would she face beasts or something darker, shadows born from fear itself? Could she withstand the forest's judgment and bring Bram back from the place where light did not reach? Suddenly, a flicker of movement caught her eye, a soft glow shimmering between the trees. Heart pounding, Willa moved toward it, careful to keep her footing on the icy ground. The glow grew stronger, revealing the spiral pattern she had seen before, etched faintly into a large stone half buried beneath the snow. It seemed to hum with a quiet power, a doorway between this world and the next. Willa knelt by the stone, tracing the spiral with her frozen fingers. The air around her shifted, a sudden hush falling over the forest, as if even the trees held their breath. She closed her eyes and whispered Bram's name, feeling the charm warm against her skin. A voice broke the silence, soft, distant, barely more than a breath. "Willa," it called. Her eyes snapped open. The voice was familiar, filled with a mixture of hope and warning. Was it Bram? Or something else? Something the forest had conjured? Willa stood, heart hammering, and pushed onward, following the faint voice that seemed to come from the very depths of the spiral stone. Each step felt heavier, as if the snow beneath her feet was thickening, pulling her down. Yet she couldn't stop now, not when she was this close. The forest began to change. The trees grew twisted and knotted, their bark darkened like burned wood. Shadows flickered at the edges of her vision, shapes that vanished when she turned to look. The cold was sharper, more biting, but inside, Willa felt a strange heat building, a fire born from determination and fear. Suddenly, the path ended at a frozen lake, its surface cracked and shimmering under a pale moonlight that filtered weakly through the heavy clouds. The spiral symbol appeared again, glowing faintly beneath the ice. Willa's breath caught in her throat. This was the heart of the forest's secret, the threshold between the world she knew and the unknown where Bram might be trapped. She knelt at the lake's edge, reaching out to touch the ice. A sudden shiver ran through her body, and the ice cracked with a sharp, echoing sound. Below, the glowing spiral twisted and turned like a serpent beneath the surface, alive and waiting. Willa's mind raced with questions. Was this place a portal? A trap? How far was she willing to go to save Bram? The chill in the air seemed to whisper warnings, but the pull in her chest was stronger than any fear. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows behind her. Maeve, her eyes bright with a strange light. "You've come far," Maeve said softly, her voice both comforting and haunting. "But the forest trials are only beginning. To save Bram, you must face what lies beneath this ice, and within your own heart." Willa's gaze met Maeve's, filled with a mixture of hope and dread. "I'm ready," she whispered, though uncertainty trembled in her voice. "Whatever comes next, I won't turn away." Maeve nodded, then stepped back into the darkness, leaving Willa alone at the lake's edge. The cold wind howled around her, carrying voices, faint, distant cries that seemed both human and otherworldly. Willa took a deep breath, her fingers brushing the glowing spiral beneath the ice. The moment stretched, heavy with promise and danger, as the forest held its secrets just out of reach. Would she find Bram on the other side? Or was she walking into a trap from which there was no return? The answers waited beneath the ice, in the heart of the brutal winter, where hope and fear danced on the edge of darkness. Willa's hand lingered on the cold surface of the ice, her fingers tracing the glowing spiral just beneath. The light pulsed faintly, like a slow heartbeat echoing through the stillness. Her breath came in shallow clouds, and the silence around her pressed heavily, as if the forest itself was watching, waiting for her next move. She glanced back toward the dark tree-line where Maeve had disappeared. That strange look in Maeve's eyes, the mix of warning and something almost like sorrow, stayed with her. Was Maeve a friend, or was something more complicated? Willa wasn't sure anymore. The forest had changed everything she thought she knew. Every step deeper into it revealed new mysteries, some that whispered of hope, others that chilled her to the bone. The ice beneath her fingertips suddenly shifted, small cracks spidering out in a delicate pattern. Willa pulled back instinctively, heart hammering. The spiral beneath the surface seemed to writhe, as if alive, and then, slowly, a patch of the ice began to melt, revealing a dark, swirling pool underneath. She stared down into it, unable to look away. The water was black as night, yet shimmering with faint flickers of silver light. Reflections danced on its surface, visions that flickered too quickly to fully understand. Faces, places, memories. She saw Bram, smiling and free, but also saw shadows lurking behind him, reaching out with long fingers. A voice broke the silence again, faint but clearer this time. Willa. She jumped and spun around, but the forest was empty. The voice was soft, almost pleading. She knew it was Bram, or something calling itself by his name. Could it be a trick? A trap? Willa swallowed hard. She wanted to turn back, to run from the cold and the dark and the creeping dread. But the thought of Bram alone in whatever nightmare lay ahead pulled her forward. She bent down, took a deep breath, and pressed her hand into the icy water. The cold shocked her, stabbing through her gloves and biting into her skin, but she held on. The surface rippled like a disturbed pond, and suddenly, a force yanked at her hand, pulling her forward. Her breath hitched. The world seemed to tilt, and she felt herself falling through cold darkness. When she opened her eyes again, Willa was no longer standing on the frozen lake. Instead, she found herself in a place that felt both familiar and strange. The air was still cold, but there was a strange warmth beneath the frost. She was in a dense forest, but the trees shimmered with an otherworldly glow, their branches draped with silvery moss that whispered softly in the breeze. The ground beneath her feet was soft, covered in thick moss and fallen leaves, untouched by snow. The sky above was a deep twilight, stars flickering faintly through a curtain of mist. It was as if she had stepped through time itself, into a world caught between day and night, winter and spring. Willa's heart pounded with a mixture of awe and fear. Where was this place? Was it real, or another illusion crafted by the forest? The spiral charm around her neck grew warm, pulsing in rhythm with her heartbeat. It was guiding her, urging her forward. As she moved cautiously through the trees, Willa's thoughts raced back to the stories her grandmother used to tell. Tales of the otherworld, a hidden realm where spirits and ancient forces dwelled. Could this be that place? A realm beyond the reach of harsh winters and starving fields, where lost souls might wander. The forest seemed alive with whispers, voices just beyond understanding. She caught glimpses of figures moving between the trees, shapes draped in shadow and light. They watched her but did not approach. Were they guardians, or something more dangerous? Suddenly, Willa heard a soft cry, fragile and distant, but unmistakable. It was a child's voice, trembling with fear. Her heart leapt. It was Bram. She followed the sound, moving deeper into the glowing forest. The voices grew louder, echoing around her like a chorus of lost hopes and forgotten dreams. The air shimmered with magic, thick and heavy like a spell woven through the trees. Willa's legs burned with cold and exhaustion, but she pressed on. Every step was a test of will, a battle against the pull to turn back and give up. The weight of the spiral charm around her neck grew heavier, grounding her in this strange place. Finally, through a curtain of silvery mist, she saw him, Bram. He was seated beneath a towering tree, eyes wide with fear and confusion. His small hands clutched a bundle of ragged cloth, and he looked up as she approached, hope flickering in his gaze. "Willa," he whispered, voice trembling. "I thought you'd never come." Tears sprang to her eyes. She rushed to him, pulling him close. "I'm here now," she said, holding him tight. "I won't leave you." But as she looked around, Willa realized they were not alone. Shadows moved just beyond the edge of the clearing, dark shapes with eyes that glowed like embers. The forest's watchers, silent, patient, waiting. Willa's breath caught. The forest had led her here, but the hardest part was still to come. Suddenly, the ground trembled beneath them. The spiral charm around her neck flared with blinding light, and the shadows hissed, recoiling like wounded beasts. Bram clung tighter, eyes wide with terror. Willa knew she had crossed a threshold. The forest was alive with ancient power, and its trials were far from over. To escape with Bram, she would have to face the darkness and the secrets buried deep within both the forest and herself. The night stretched on, filled with whispered warnings and silent threats. Willa stood ready, heart fierce against the cold, as the spiral's glow cast long shadows across the otherworldly trees. What waited beyond the clearing? What dangers lurked in the depths of the forest's frozen heart? And could Willa protect Bram from the forest's cruel embrace? The answers hung just out of reach, wrapped in ice and shadow, waiting for the dawn. Willa's arms tightened around Bram as the shadows edged closer, their glowing eyes flickering like distant stars in the eerie twilight. The forest seemed to hold its breath, the silence broken only by the low hum of the spiral charm resting against her chest. Its warmth pulsed like a heartbeat, steady and strong, reminding her of the promise she'd made, to bring Bram home, no matter the cost. The dark shapes lurking beyond the clearing didn't move forward, but their presence was unmistakable, silent watchers who held the power to decide whether Willa and Bram could leave this place. The air itself felt heavy, thick with an ancient tension that pressed on Willa's lungs. She could feel the weight of centuries resting on the frozen ground beneath her feet. Bram whimpered softly, pressing his small face against her shoulder. "Why won't they come closer?" he asked, voice trembling. Willa shook her head slowly, unsure. "I don't know, but we have to be ready for anything." As she spoke, the glow from the spiral charm intensified, casting a pale light across the mossy clearing. Shadows flickered and twisted, as if the forest was alive, responding to her presence. The trees whispered secrets on the wind, voices older than time itself, warning of trials yet to come. Willa's mind raced back to the stories she'd heard as a child, tales of spirits and guardians, of ancient pacts made between the living and the unseen. Could these shadows be those guardians, protectors of the forest's secrets? Or were they something darker, remnants of winters past that had never truly let go? She knelt down beside Bram, brushing the tangled hair from his face. "We're going to find a way through this," she promised, voice steady even as her heart pounded. "But we have to stay calm and move carefully." The boy nodded, trusting her completely despite the fear shining in his eyes. Willa felt a fierce surge of protectiveness rise up inside her. Bram was everything she had left, the last light in a world grown cold and uncertain. Suddenly, a sharp crack echoed through the forest, breaking the tense stillness. The ground trembled again, this time beneath their feet. Willa stood quickly, eyes scanning the trees. From the shadows, a figure stepped forward, a tall woman draped in robes woven from shimmering silver threads, her face partially hidden beneath a hood. The woman's eyes glowed with a strange, ethereal light. "You have come far, child," she said, voice soft but carrying weight. "But the forest trials are not yet ended." Willa swallowed hard, stepping protectively in front of Bram. "Who are you?" she asked, voice firm despite the cold creeping up her spine. "I am the keeper of the spiral," the woman replied, her gaze steady. "I guard the boundary between worlds, the living and the lost. Many have come seeking what you seek, few leave unchanged. Willa's grip on Bram's hand tightened. We don't have a choice. I have to save him. The keeper nodded slowly, as if acknowledging a truth that went beyond words. The forest demands a price for its gifts, she said. To return your brother, you must face the darkness that dwells within yourself, and the winter that has frozen your land for so long. Willa felt a chill that wasn't from the cold. The words echoed through her mind. What darkness? What price? She glanced down at Bram, whose wide eyes searched hers for answers she didn't have. The keeper stepped closer, raising a hand to reveal a small, carved wooden box. Inside this box lies the first test. You must open it and accept what it contains. Only then will the path forward be revealed. Willa hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. The box looked ordinary, but she sensed it held something powerful, something that could change everything. With a steady breath, she reached out and took the box, feeling its weight in her hands. The moment her fingers touched the latch, a soft glow spread from the spiral charm on her neck, linking the two in a silent bond. Slowly, she lifted the lid. Inside was a single delicate feather, pure white, yet shimmering with an icy sheen. The feather seemed to pulse with life, a symbol both fragile and powerful. The keeper's voice was low but clear. This feather belongs to the winter raven, a creature born from the cold and shadow of the longest nights. To pass the test, you must find the raven's nest and prove your courage. Only then will the forest grant you passage. Willa's mind reeled. The winter raven was a legend told in whispers, the bird that carried the souls of those lost to the bitter cold, the guardian of the frozen wilderness. Finding it would mean entering the very heart of the winter's grasp. Bram looked up at her, fear mingling with hope. We can do it, Willa. She smiled, though uncertainty flickered beneath. We have to. For you, for all of us. The keeper nodded and stepped back, her form dissolving into the mist like smoke on the wind. The shadows retreated, leaving the clearing bathed in the pale glow of the spiral charm. Willa felt a sudden resolve harden within her. The forest trials were beginning in earnest, and the path ahead was uncertain and dangerous. But every step she took was a step closer to saving Bram, and to breaking the cruel hold of winter that had gripped their lives for so long. Gathering her strength, she stood and looked toward the dense trees beyond the clearing, where the forest grew darker and the unknown awaited. The weight of the feather in her hand was a reminder of the challenge ahead, and the price they might have to pay. With Bram close beside her, Willa stepped forward into the deepening shadows, ready to face whatever waited in the cold heart of the forest. The forest whispered its ancient secrets around them. The spiral charms light a fragile beacon in the growing dark. Would the winter raven reveal itself? Would Willa's courage be enough to save Bram and their village from the endless winter's cruel grasp? The answers lay ahead, hidden in the shadows and the frost. And the story was far from over. The wind picked up as Willa and Bram moved deeper into the forest, the trees closing in tighter around them. Snow began to fall again, light at first, then heavier, blanketing the undergrowth in a crisp white layer. Each step forward felt like it echoed louder than it should, swallowed slowly by the silence of the woods. The spiral charm around Willa's neck had dimmed slightly, pulsing now with a more erratic rhythm, as if unsure of the path they had chosen. They followed no clear trail. The ground sloped and twisted, scattered with broken branches and animal tracks too large to belong to anything friendly. The cold grew sharper, biting not just at Willa's fingers but at her thoughts. She couldn't shake the sensation that the forest had become more than a test. It felt alive and watching. Hours passed. The light in the sky never changed. It hovered in a dull gray twilight that gave no clue of time. Bram stumbled, his small legs tired, and Willa hoisted him onto her back. He didn't protest. His head rested on her shoulder, and soon she heard the soft rhythm of his breathing. Still, she pressed forward. The feather in her pocket remained cold, but unbroken, its shimmer constant, guiding, or perhaps warning. Then, the trees abruptly thinned. Before them stretched a wide, frozen river, its surface cracked like old glass. At the center stood a stone pillar, half buried in ice. Etched into its surface was the same spiral symbol, but this time something new had been carved above it, a mark Willa didn't recognize. A triangle with a dot inside it. The wind howled across the river's surface as if to keep them from coming closer. She set Bram down and stepped toward the edge of the ice. The moment her foot touched it, the spiral charm grew hot against her chest. She backed away quickly. Something was wrong. Bram pointed to the symbol. "That's not the forest mark," he whispered. "I saw in a dream. The man with the eyes like fire. He wore it on his hand." Willa turned slowly to him. "What man?" "I don't know. He looked like father, but older. His coat was torn. He said the winter never ends unless the promise is broken." Willa stared at the symbol again, heart racing. "A promise?" Bram nodded. "He said someone broke a promise a long time ago. And that's why the cold came." The pillar loomed in front of them, casting a strange shadow that didn't match the sunless sky. Willa couldn't explain it, but she suddenly understood this wasn't just a trial of the forest. There was something older at play, something buried under layers of snow and silence. A cracking sound echoed across the ice. Then another. The river began to shift beneath them, the surface rippling like something moved beneath it. Willa grabbed Bram and backed away, but before they could turn, the ice split wide open. From the gap rose a figure wrapped in tattered robes, soaked and frozen, with skin stretched tight over hollow bones. Its eyes burned with a pale blue flame, and its mouth moved, though no sound came out. Willa staggered backward, stumbling over a root. The figure stepped fully onto the ice, and with it came a gust of unnatural wind. The trees bowed toward it, and the spiral charm flickered violently like a candle in a storm. Then the figure spoke, not in words, but directly into Willa's thoughts. "You bear the spiral, but not the burden." She clutched the charm instinctively. "What are you?" "I am what remains. What your people buried. The keeper of the broken vow." Bram stepped behind her, his voice small. "It's him, from a dream." Willa's breath caught. She looked into the spirit's hollow face and saw, for just a flash, a resemblance, something painfully familiar. "You were one of us," she whispered. "I was the first to take the oath, to bind winter beneath the mountain. But when fear came, they turned from the pact. And so the cold returned. Endless, unforgiving. The pieces clicked together. This wasn't just a cruel winter or a trial of the forest. It was the result of a choice made generations ago, by people who had forgotten what they'd promised in exchange for survival. And now, the forest wanted more than courage. It wanted restitution. The figure stepped forward, and the river cracked again under its weight. The triangle mark on the pillar pulsed. To restore what was lost, you must do what they would not. You must face the mountain and awaken what sleeps beneath. Willa felt the weight of the feather in her pocket, the warmth of the spiral charm, and the eyes of her little brother fixed on her with trust. The stakes had changed. This wasn't about one child or one family. It was about the entire valley. The endless winters, the sickness, the silence that had stolen joy from their lives. She looked up at the figure. What's in the mountain? Truth, and the choice they feared to make. Before she could ask more, the spirit sank back into the ice, its voice echoing once more in her head. South, to the ridge where the sun never touches. There lies the door. The ice sealed behind it, and the river returned to its unnatural stillness. Willa turned to Bram, who stood quietly, eyes wide but calm. Are we going to the mountain? He asked. She nodded. We have to. As they turned south, the forest seemed to open just slightly, a path forming through the snow. The spiral charm warmed again, steadier now, as though it approved. But Willa felt no comfort. For the first time, she realized this wasn't a journey of survival. It was a reckoning. The spiral wasn't just a charm. It was a key, and someone long ago had locked something terrible away with it. Now, the forest demanded they open the door again. The sunless sky loomed overhead as Willa and Bram followed the narrow, winding path southward. The trees thinned, not because they were sparse, but because something larger had pushed them aside, as if the land itself had shifted to make way for whatever lay ahead. The snow underfoot was deeper here, but less disturbed. No deer tracks, no fox prints, no bird song. It was the kind of silence that made your heart race, even if nothing moved. Willa tightened her grip on Bram's hand. He didn't speak, but he glanced up at her now and then, searching her face for strength. She tried to give it. The spiral charm around her neck beat like a second heartbeat, pulsing with soft warmth that reassured her they were still on the right path, even as her legs ached and her breath clouded thick in the frozen air. The ridge the spirit had spoken of came into view by late afternoon, or what she thought was afternoon. Time had become a soft concept, blurred by the endless gray and the weight of snow. The ridge wasn't steep, but it curved like a spine, black stone poking out from beneath the frost. Trees here grew crooked and slanted, as though repelled by something beneath the soil. At the base of the ridge stood a stone doorframe. No actual door, just a tall archway marked with the same triangle with a dot symbol and spiral pattern below it. Moss had curled into its cracks, and frost clung to its surface like brittle lace. Willa could feel the heat of the charm growing as they approached. She knelt beside Bram and gently placed a hand on his shoulder. "You stay here. I won't go far. Just to look." He nodded solemnly, hands buried in his coat sleeves, eyes wide and filled with an understanding beyond his years. Willa crossed the last few feet and passed under the archway. The moment she stepped through, the air changed. Not colder, warmer, dry too, as though she'd walked into a different season. The ground beneath her shifted from snow to stone, and a narrow staircase carved into the ridge descended into darkness. She hesitated, then took a deep breath and stepped down. The first few steps echoed loudly, her boots tapping against smooth rock. The light from the outside world disappeared almost immediately, but the spiral charm cast a soft glow, just enough to see by. The stairwell curved gently downward, as if coiling into the earth. Symbols carved into the walls passed her in silence. Spirals, triangles, shapes that made her head throb slightly when she looked at them too long. The feather in her pocket quivered, almost as if reacting to the space itself. Finally, the staircase ended in a wide chamber. The ceiling arched high above, supported by stone columns etched with ancient runes. In the center was a platform with 3 objects placed upon it: a stone bowl, a dagger with a spiral carved into the hilt, and a small leather-bound book that looked centuries old. Willa stepped closer, her breath catching her throat. The charm pulsed faster. The dagger seemed to hum with quiet energy. She reached for the book first, brushing snow off its cover, then opening it gently. The pages were fragile, stained with time and dampness. The first page held a single sentence: "To seal away what lives below, 3 gave their blood." She turned the page slowly. The next was filled with drawings, images of a mountain split open, of shadow pouring out like smoke, of figures in cloaks placing their hands on a glowing stone. Further in, she found what looked like instructions, written in strange phrasing, but understandable. The mountain had once housed something. No one named it, but the illustrations made it clear it wasn't human. It brought the first winter, endless and cruel, until 3 brave souls from the village made a pact. One would give their voice, one their blood, and one their memory. Together, these offerings would lock the creature beneath the mountain. But the pact required maintenance. Every generation, a sign-bearer had to return to this chamber and renew the vow. Somewhere along the line, that duty had been forgotten. Willa closed the book with trembling hands. Her ancestors had failed to renew the pact. That's why the winters had grown longer, harsher, why the land was thinning, why the forest had become restless. She turned back toward the stairs, heart racing, and climbed back to the surface. Bram stood exactly where she'd left him, his cheeks red from cold, but his eyes alert. "What was in there?" he asked. "Truth," she said quietly, "and a choice." That night, they camped near the stone archway, nestled in a shallow alcove that shielded them from the wind. Willa didn't sleep much. The sky above flickered with strange light, like a storm forming beyond the clouds. And from deep inside the mountain, she thought she heard a sound, Not a growl, not a roar, but something slower, like breath stirring for the first time in ages. At dawn, or what might have been dawn, they headed back toward the village. Willa didn't speak much. Bram knew better than to ask. But everything had changed. Back in the valley, people gathered around them as they returned. Willa's clothes were torn, her hair matted with frost, but her eyes were clearer than anyone had seen in years. The elders came first. Osric, Marla, even old Garan, who hadn't left his cottage in months. Willa stood in the center of the crowd, holding the book, the feather, and the dagger, her voice strong but quiet. "We broke the vow," she said, "and now something wants to wake." The villagers listened in stunned silence as she explained what she had seen. Most had never heard of the pact. Some didn't believe it, but others did. They remembered tales from their grandparents, strange dreams, warnings carved into doors, the time the river froze and stayed that way until spring refused to come. Osric's face was pale. "You mean to say this winter isn't just nature?" "No," Willis said. "It's waiting for us to choose again. Either restore what was promised or face what comes next." That night, a meeting was called. The whole village crammed into the longhouse, its walls lined with candles and nervous eyes. Willis sat near the fire, the charm heavy against her chest. The elders debated for hours. Some wanted to flee. Others argued the mountain would follow them. But one voice cut through it all, Bram's. "If no one does it, the cold never ends." Everyone turned. He stood tall for his age, fists clenched at his sides. "It's not just about us. If we don't fix it, no spring ever comes again. Not for anyone." Willa watched him, a lump rising in her throat. He wasn't just brave. He was right. But before they could vote, before any decision could be made, the ground shook. Not a tremor, not a distant rumble, but a deep, rolling quake that knocked mugs from tables and sent a few villagers stumbling to their knees. The fire flickered, and outside, from the direction of the mountain, came a sound like thunder cracking in slow motion. The door was opening. The tremor faded, but its echo lingered in every chest like a second heartbeat. For a long moment, no one moved. The longhouse, usually full of warmth from the hearth and thick with smoke from dried herbs, now felt cold. The fire still burned, but it no longer offered comfort. It flickered too much, erratic, like it, too, had been shaken by whatever ancient thing had stirred. Outside, the village dogs howled. Not the usual playful barks or howls of hunger. These were low, mournful cries, the kind that made bones feel brittle and hearts feel small. Willa rose to her feet slowly. "It's begun," she said, barely above a whisper, but every soul in the room heard it. Osric stood with her. "What can we do?" She held up the book, now worn and curling at the edges from frost and damp. "It says there's still time. Not much, but enough." Her fingers traced the spiral etched into the dagger's hilt. "We need 3, just like before." "3 what?" Someone called from the back. "3 fools. 3 who understand what sacrifice means," she said. The longhouse quieted again. Bram slipped closer to her side, eyes wide but determined. She shook her head gently at him. "Not you. You've already done more than enough." But even as she said it, she knew this wasn't something she could stop. The mountain wasn't just waking, it was watching, and it had already chosen who it would accept. Marla spoke next, slowly, with a voice like dry leaves. "I remember the tale now. My gran used to hum a tune at the hearth. She said it was to keep the cold one dreaming. She hummed a few shaky notes, low, strange tones that didn't quite sound like music but had an odd rhythm, like a lullaby buried under soil. Some in the room recognized it. Others closed their eyes, letting the eerie song pull at half-forgotten childhood memories. The pact wasn't a lie," she said, looking to Willa. "And the offerings, they were real. Voice, blood, memory," Willa said, her voice steady. 3 people. Each gives 1. That's how the gate stays shut." Osric let out a slow breath. "Then I will give my voice." His face was resolute, like the decision had always been waiting inside him. "Let the mountain take it. I've said enough for this life." Marla's eyes glistened. "Then I will give my memories. My mind is already fading. Let me give what I have left for something that matters." They both looked at Willa. She knew what was left. I'll give my blood, she said. A hush fell over the room. Bram stepped forward again, voice small but firm. Why does it have to be you? Isn't there anyone else who can give it? Because it chose me, she said gently, crouching beside him. You saw it, Bram. You were there. This charm, the feather, the door, it didn't appear for anyone else. But if you die, I won't. Or I might. I don't know. But if I do nothing, we all will. She touched his cheek, her eyes soft. Spring doesn't come by waiting. Sometimes you have to earn it. They set out the next morning. The sky had darkened, even though it wasn't yet midday. Clouds twisted like ink in water. A storm was forming, but not of snow. The air had changed, no longer just cold, but electric. Charged. The three chosen walked ahead, cloaks pulled tight, their faces set with quiet purpose. Behind them, the rest of the village followed. Not everyone, but many. Some would not come near the ridge again. Others came in silence, simply needing to see it for themselves. By the time they reached the stone archway, snow had begun to fall in fat, heavy flakes. The world looked painted in grays and whites, the trees hunched under the weight of centuries. Willa stood before the archway and turned back to look at the crowd. No one comes beyond this point unless the mountain calls you. This is where the path splits. People murmured, some stepping back. Others simply stood still, watching as Osric, Marla, and Willa passed under the stone. This time, Bram didn't try to follow, but he didn't turn away either. They descended the stairs into the heart of the ridge. The warmth returned the moment they stepped into the chamber. The spiral charm lit the way. The bowl, the dagger, the book, still waiting. Willa helped Marla to the platform first. The old woman touched the book softly, then sat beside the bowl. I don't know what it will take, she said, her voice dreamy. But I hope, somewhere, a child will remember the sun on their face. Willa gave her the feather. Marla held it tight. Then Osric stood, cleared his throat, and closed his eyes. I speak now my final words. Let them be remembered. He turned to Willa. Tell Bram, he's a good lad. She nodded, tears stinging her eyes. He stepped to the edge of the platform and touched the spiral etched in stone. A deep hum filled the chamber. The flame from Willa's charm flared. A breeze rushed past her. No, not wind. A whisper. Thousands of voices in a single breath. And then Osric opened his mouth, and no sound came. His voice was gone. Taken. He staggered but smiled, pressing his fingers to his throat, then nodding. Willa helped him sit. Now it was Marla's turn. She held the feather, placed it inside the bowl, and leaned over it. Her eyes fluttered shut. A silence heavier than before fell over the chamber. Then she exhaled and did not inhale again. Her body remained seated, peaceful, her face calm. But Willa could feel it. Marla's memories had left her. They had seeped into the chamber, wrapped into the stone. She wasn't dead, but she was gone. Osric reached out to hold her hand, and she didn't resist, but she didn't respond either. Now only Willa remained. She picked up the dagger. Her hand trembled, but she steadied it. Whatever is listening, she said aloud, whatever is watching, I offer this freely. Not in fear, but in hope. She drew the blade across her palm. The blood pooled quickly, and she held her hand over the bowl, letting it fall. Red droplets stained the feather. Steam rose from the bowl's surface. The chamber began to vibrate. Not violently, but steadily, rhythmically like a drum. Symbols on the walls glowed faintly. The spiral in the floor lit up. The book flapped open on its own, pages turning quickly until it landed on one final phrase. The gate accepts. The pact renews. Sleep returns for now. But then the vibration deepened. A rumble, not from the floor, but from behind the chamber. A hidden door slid open, and behind it something moved. Not fast, not violent, but massive, curious. A shadow. And then a voice from nowhere, yet everywhere. One was false. Willa froze. The light dimmed, and she realized someone had lied. The pact was not complete, and something else had been set free. The silence after the voice spoke was worse than the tremor, worse than the cold. Willa stood frozen, blood still dripping from her palm into the bowl, eyes locked on the dark opening beyond Stonewall. She could feel the presence behind it, a vast, breathing awareness that had waited far too long to be deceived. Osric, mute but wide-eyed, gripped Marla's hand. She didn't move. Her mind had drifted so far from the room that even the echo of the words hadn't stirred her. One was false. The phrase repeated in Willa's head, over and over, like the steady crack of wood splitting under frost. Something had gone wrong. The pact should have held. The gate should have closed. Instead, it had opened just a little, just enough. She turned toward the bowl again, scanning the contents. Her blood still steamed. The feather lay, soaked in red. The air trembled around it. But something felt light, hollow. Then she looked to Marla. The old woman's lips moved. Barely. Willa leaned in, and for the first time in hours, Marla blinked. A whisper escaped her, soft as falling snow. I only gave part of it. Willa's heart pounded. What do you mean? I was afraid, Marla murmured. I held onto the face of my son. I didn't let that one go. Willa's breath caught in her throat. That was it. The gate demanded everything. Not almost. Not most. But all. And Marla, in her last flicker of self, had clung to the memory that meant the most. It had been enough to disrupt the pact. And now the mountain, whatever spirit or force it held, had been awakened in confusion and suspicion. Not rage. Not yet. But doubt. And that was dangerous in something ancient. Willa stood and stepped back from the bowl. The dagger felt heavier in her hand now, as if it, too, since the ritual had failed. She looked toward the open passage and saw the faint shimmer of something vast. A shape made of shadow and warmth, coiled in the silence. I'll go, she said aloud. Osric reached for her, but she gently pulled away. It has to be me now. I'm the only one it hasn't judged. She walked toward the opening. Her boots echoed faintly against the stone, though the chamber seemed to swallow the sound before it could reach the others. The moment she crossed the threshold, the warmth enveloped her. Not the comfort of fire, but the heat of something ancient and buried far too long. She stepped into a space that wasn't entirely real. The walls curved like the inside of a shell, with no seams, only smooth, spiraling stone. The creature, or being, or memory, lay ahead, uncoiled and resting. It looked like nothing Willa had ever seen. Not beast, not human. More like a thought too big to fit inside the world. Its surface shimmered, not solid, but layered in images and echoes. Faces passed across its form, old voices, long-lost names. It was made of the memories it had been fed, and it remembered each one. Then she heard it again, this time not aloud, but inside her own skull. Why false? Willa hesitated, then knelt, lowering her head. It wasn't meant to deceive. She was afraid. But I am not. The silence pressed in closer. She held up the dagger. Take what remains. All of it. My voice. My blood. My memories. No trick. No holding back. The being shimmered again. Her own face appeared in its surface. Older, then younger, then forgotten. And then it asked something new. What will you take in return? She blinked. That wasn't part of the story. No one had ever said anything about that. I didn't come for anything, she said, confused. Just to close the gate. The presence stirred. Always they come with fear. Or want. Never without price. You give freely. Yes. Then I give freely. The world collapsed in light. When Willa opened her eyes again, she was standing outside the ridge. The longhouse was in sight. The air was bright. Spring. Real, honest, soft-edged spring. The snow had melted in thick, muddy drifts. The trees were budding. A sparrow flew overhead. She turned and saw Osric behind her. His voice returned. Willa, I'm here, she said. He hugged her, fierce and shaking. You vanished. We thought. I don't know what happened, she whispered. But I think it's over. They returned to the village together. The people stared, some wept. Marla still sat, eyes open, distant. But peace had returned to her face. Bram ran to Willa, tears streaking his cheeks. It's warm, he cried. It's really warm. She knelt and hugged him. Yes, and it's not going away this time. The village began to rebuild. Slowly, with care. Crops were planted. The animals returned from the forest. The strange sickness vanished like mist under sunlight. For a while, everything was good. until the day Bram returned from the woods, older now, holding something tightly in his hand. A feather. Blue. Perfect. Willa froze. He handed it to her and said, "It was waiting on the stone by the ridge." And there was a voice. "What did it say?" she asked, her throat dry. He looked up, eyes wide. It said, "One still remembers." Willa stood motionless, the blue feather pinched delicately between her fingers. It was soft, cool, and impossibly clean, as if untouched by wind or soil or time. The weight of it wasn't in its form, but in its meaning. A chill, colder than the harshest winter she'd ever known, settled into her bones. She stared at Bram, his young face still innocent, but his eyes had seen something. "Did it speak again?" she asked carefully, crouching to meet his gaze. "No," Bram whispered, "just once." Then it got quiet again. The villagers had resumed life with a cautious hope, but that hope now teetered. Willa looked across the fields to where the last snow had melted, where new shoots had started to grow, where laughter had returned. Yet now she felt a silence pressing in, as if the land itself held its breath. That night, Willa placed the feather on the old altar stone behind her home. She didn't burn it, didn't bury it, just left it there. The mountain wouldn't know, she understood. But as she tried to sleep, her dreams twisted again, more vivid than ever. She saw Marla, not aged and broken as she had been, but young. Her laughter echoed through meadows of green, hand in hand with a boy who looked like Osric, though younger. Then the wind shifted. The meadow darkened. The trees leaned in close, whispering something she couldn't catch. Marla's laughter turned to sobs. In the dream, Willow walked forward, pushing through the hush of leaves. The whispering voices grew clearer. Not forgotten, not released, bound in memory. She jolted awake in sweat. Outside, a cold wind scraped against the shutters. The next day, she visited Marla. The old woman sat in her usual spot by the hearth, knitting nothing in particular, eyes blank but aware. Willa knelt beside her. "Do you remember the gate?" she asked gently. Marla's fingers paused. "I never told it everything," she murmured, voice brittle with time. I thought it would be enough. But I see now it never is. What's left, Marla? What didn't you give?" The old woman slowly turned her head, locking eyes with Willa. "It wasn't my son I kept," she said softly. "That's what I told you. But the truth was darker." Willa's breath hitched. "I kept the fear," Marla whispered. "I was too afraid to let it go. I fed it every year with false offerings, hoping it would forget me. But fear isn't forgotten. It grows. It watches." The words hit hard. Willa realized the truth. The entity behind the gate wasn't just fed by memory or sacrifice. It was shaped by what was withheld. And Marla, for all her strength and knowledge, had been unable to face the very thing that mattered most. "Then the pact," Willa began, "was never real," Marla finished. "It was only a delay." Outside, clouds had gathered. The birds that had returned days earlier were gone again. And over the distant ridge, a faint light pulsed, slow, blue, and alive. That evening, the wind grew colder. Not the brutal, biting wind of winter, but something more still, more silent. A hush that fell over the village like a fog of silence. The kind of air that made even fire feel far away. Osric stood by the old watchtower, peering toward the edge of the forest. "Do you feel that?" he asked. Willa nodded. "It's remembering us again." That night, no one in the village slept. Doors were barred. Candles burned to the wick. Even the animals seemed restless, pacing, whining, refusing food. Something moved in the woods. Not loud, just present. Willa returned to the stone altar where the feather still lay untouched. She sat cross-legged in front of it, alone, and whispered into the wind. "If you're watching, listen now," she said. "There's nothing left to hide, nothing more to pretend." The blue feather trembled. "I am not Marla," she continued. "I won't offer you lies." The wind stopped completely. "I am afraid," she said, "but I won't let fear rule us. You've taken enough. So if something must be given, take it from me." The ground under the altar rumbled softly. A line of frost crept out from beneath the stone. Willa felt it snake around her hands, up her wrists, and into her chest. It wasn't pain, exactly, it was memory. It pulled her inward, showing her own life, frame by frame. Her mother's smile. The night her father died. The first time she felt safe. The last time she felt joy. Then, a new vision, one she hadn't lived. A long hall filled with echoes. Faces she didn't know, lined along a stone table. Murmuring, watching. They looked like her, but also like Osric, and Bram, and Marla. Generations of memory, looping back centuries. And there, at the far end of the table, sat a figure made of shadow and frost. Its eyes glowed with the shimmer of a blue feather. It was not angry, not cruel, but endless. She understood then. It wasn't just about sacrifices. The gate existed because it had been made to hold something far older than the village, older than the mountain. A memory that should never have existed. A mistake that had been sealed away and then fed through the years with pieces of humanity. Fear, grief, guilt. The being didn't want freedom. It wanted to be forgotten. And yet, the villagers had remembered it, year after year, clinging to old rituals, false tales, whispered superstitions. In trying to keep it sealed, they'd kept alive. Willa opened her eyes, breath short. To end this, truly, someone would have to let it all go. Let the fear go. Let the story go. Let even the memory go. She returned to her home and sat with Osric and Bram. What if we stopped speaking of it, she asked. Osric frowned. You mean, pretend it didn't happen? No, Willis said. Let go for real. Burn the records. Bury the altar. Forget the rituals. Forget everything. Bram looked up. Even the blue feather? Even that. Osric didn't speak for a long time. Then he nodded. It's hard, he said quietly. But maybe that's why it's the only way. And so the next day, they did something unthinkable. They gathered every record of the winters, every scrap of the rituals, every story passed down. They piled them on the old hilltop altar, not with reverence, but with resolve. And they burned it all. The smoke drifted into the air like a final breath. No chance, no farewell, just silence. For the first time in generations, the village let go. That night, the wind changed. Not cold, not warm, just clean. And over the ridge, the light faded. The feather, once so perfect and unnatural, crumbled into dust on the stone. And in the woods, nothing stirred. In the days that followed the burning of the old altar and the quiet fading of the strange light over the ridge, the village shifted in ways that couldn't be seen at first. There were no celebrations. No loud proclamations of victory, just quiet, slow mornings and the soft hum of work returning to the rhythm of life. Snow didn't fall again that spring, and the wind no longer carried the weight it once did. Willa stood at the edge of the woods one morning, her hands wrapped around a warm mug. Steam curled into the crisp air, but it wasn't the bitter cold that bit at her cheeks anymore. It was just the normal chill of early spring. Birds sang again. The ground was soft beneath her boots, no longer hiding secrets. She breathed in deeply and let it all settle in her chest. There was nothing unusual about this moment, and that's what made it so extraordinary. Bram had started sleeping through the night again. The blue feather had been forgotten, just as they'd promised it would be. The boy's eyes no longer darted toward shadows. He smiled more now, laughed without flinching. It was a slow, kind of healing, but real. The kind that didn't need words or rituals, only time and peace. Osric spent most of his days helping the other villagers mend roofs and clear fallen branches. The winter had been harsh, but the damage wasn't impossible to fix. In fact, with the fear gone, people seemed to work more willingly with one another. There was less grumbling, fewer disputes. For so long, they'd survived winter by preparing for the worst, always watching the horizon for the next threat. But now, they seemed more open to watching the sky for something else, something lighter. Rain. Sunday possibility. Willa often wondered if the thing beyond the gate had truly disappeared or if it had simply moved on. But the longer she lived in the quiet that followed, the more she realized that maybe it didn't matter. What mattered was that they had stopped feeding it, stopped keeping it alive with their fear. And in doing so, they had taken back something they didn't even know they had lost, the freedom to look forward without dread. Marla passed quietly one morning, her hands folded neatly on her chest, her eyes closed as if she were simply resting. She didn't speak again after that final confession, but Willa suspected she had found peace in those last few days. The fear she had held for so long had been heavier than any winter. Letting it go had been the final gift she'd given the village. They buried her beneath the tree behind her cottage. No grand ceremony, just a few villagers standing in silence, hats in hand, remembering her for what she had been. Not a witch or a prophet, but a woman who had carried more than her share of sorrow. That spring, the children planted flowers around the tree. Bram picked bright yellow ones. He said she would have liked them. No one argued. As the seasons turned, the stories of the gate faded. Not because people were forced to forget, but because they didn't feel the need to remember. Life had enough meaning in the small things. Bread baked fresh in the oven, hands warmed by the fire, a shared laugh across the table. These were the memories worth passing on, not the ones made of shadow and cold. Years went by. Bram grew taller. The winters still came, but they were just winters. Cold, yes, and sometimes cruel, but not cursed. The fear that had once crept into every corner of the village never returned. And slowly, the village changed. New houses went up. Old ones were rebuilt. People started talking about traveling to nearby towns. Trade began again. A few even left to chase their own futures elsewhere. Willa stayed. She never married, never left, but she was happy. Not in a grand way, but in the quiet way that lives in long walks and warm hands and the scent of cedar smoke on cold evenings. She taught the children how to grow herbs, how to find wild berries, and how to listen to the land without fear. And when they asked about the old stone on the hill, she would just smile and say it was nothing now. Just a rock where people used to leave things they didn't need anymore. Sometimes, late at night, Willa would sit on her doorstep and look up at the stars. She would think of all the stories they'd once told to explain the winters, the monsters, the ghosts, the sacrifices. It struck her how much easier it had been to believe in those things than to face the truth. That fear, once seated, could grow wild in any place. That the hardest thing wasn't surviving a brutal winter. It was choosing not to live in fear the next one. And that choice, once made, changed everything. One afternoon, as the trees bloomed for the first time that year, Bram came running up the path to Willa's cottage. He was taller now, nearly grown. His cheeks were flushed, his breath quick. "You won't believe it," he said, grinning. "I saw a fox near the riverbank. Red as fire. Didn't run away when it saw me." Willa laughed softly. "Maybe it remembered you," she said. "Or maybe it just wasn't scared." She looked at him for a moment, her smile deepening. "Maybe neither of you are." He stood next to her as they watched the wind move gently through the trees, bending the grass without breaking it. The village lay below, peaceful and full of life. Somewhere, someone was baking bread. Somewhere else, a dog barked joyfully at a passing wagon. It was a normal day. No spirits, no shadows, just the soft, steady beat of life moving forward. And that, Willa thought, was the best kind of ending. Not dramatic, not loud, just quiet, just full, just real. And as the evening sun dipped below the trees, casting long golden light across the hills, the village rested, no longer waiting for something to go wrong, but finally ready to live.